I've had 3 girlfriends in my life. My current girlfriend, who I've been with for 3 years happily, my first girlfriend in college, and my second girlfriend, Kelly. Kelly was someone who put me through hell emotionally and sometimes physically. I'll start from the beginning. Kelly and I matched on Bumble, and upon seeing that we both attended the same college, we based our conversation off that and any people that we may have mutually known. After seeing each other for about a month, we made it official, and we dated for about 6 months. Like most relationships, at first everything seemed great, and we got along fine. But the illusion of being a happy couple faded after a few months, when Kelly would start becoming very controlling and downright obsessive over knowing what I was doing at all times. The longer we dated, the more I realized she didn't have many friends at all, maybe 1 or 2, that's about it. So when I would go out to see my friends on the weekends without her, she would always obsessively text me every 15 minutes asking me for proof of where I was. If I were ever to be at a bar without her, she'd throw a fit. She'd make me share my location with her after 4 or 5 months of dating. It got to the point I couldn't handle it anymore. She had too much time on her hands to worry about what I was doing constantly. I couldn't even go see my friends without constantly being attacked and interrogated by her. But one night, things escalated far worse than they ever had. Admittedly, I ended up at a bar and very drunk with a group of my drinking buddies. We started at my friend Kevin's house, and I didn't intend on ending up at a bar. When I got home, Kelly was waiting in front of my mom's house for me, with a batshit crazy look on her face. This was one of the first nights that she laid hands on me, repeatedly hitting me while screaming I'm a dirty cheater and other insane things, all while outside causing a scene for the neighbors to hear. After I had to grab her arms to get her to stop, she shouted things like, "Get off me, I'm calling the police." So I let go and told her we're done. This was officially when I broke up with her, and her response was not good. Every single day I received paragraphs upon paragraphs, ranging from angry to alleged regretfulness back to angry. Eventually, I felt more comfortable blocking Kelly for a while, but that wasn't the end. One of my friends who followed her on Instagram still sent me a screenshot of the picture she posted with this big, ugly, muscular guy who looked like he wanted to kill the person taking the picture. I made a joke to my friends saying, "Wow, I see she upgraded." Kelly did the unimaginable though. I was all cozy in my bed, in the perceived safety of the house. I was home alone, as I usually was living in my parents' house. That was when I heard a pounding at the front door downstairs. I jumped out of bed and went out to the living room to listen. There was a man's screams from the other side. He was screaming, "Open up, pussy." I didn't acknowledge him. I didn't want him to know I was home. Then some random number was calling my phone. When I didn't pick up, I got a text from someone threatening to kill me and telling me to open the door before he breaks the window. I ignored these and called 911. I heard glass breaking from outside. I looked out my window and I saw a familiar, huge bearded guy right by my SUV. He was smashing my windows. I recognized the guy to be from Kelly's picture. As I was on the phone with 911, I explained that my crazy ex-girlfriend sent her current boyfriend to my house to threaten me, and he was currently damaging my vehicle. I answered a bunch of questions as police were en route. All the while the man kept screaming things from outside and pounding on my door and sending threatening texts. Police showed up surprisingly quickly to my relief, and they caught the guy still in front of my house. They saw him step off the front stoop after he saw the cop car pulling up. I went outside right away and showed the police my car and the texts, and the big, roid-raging man was still yelling at me that I'm gonna fucking pay for talking shit about him to Kelly. I told him I hadn't spoken to Kelly in months, and he said, "Oh yeah, what about the texts?" as he was in handcuffs already. I said, "What texts?" and he accused me of being a bullshitter. So after he was brought away in one of 2 police cars, I gave the second police officer whatever information he needed of the situation between Kelly and I, and he told me I had a good case for harassment and should definitely file for a restraining order immediately. He told me to head to the precinct the next day, which is what I did, but I also unblocked Kelly and asked her what she said to her boyfriend and why. And after she responded claiming she had no idea what I was talking about, I sent her a long text giving her a piece of my mind, basically telling her about my getting a restraining order and telling her to seek help. I never heard from her again, nor her crazy, roid-raging, now ex-boyfriend. According to my friend, she deleted the picture with him literally the next day after that happened. I currently have a restraining order against both her and her ex-boyfriend, Javier Cruz. Be careful who you decide to date. There's a whole lot of crazy out there. I dated my ex Kian for 2 years. It was a toxic, abusive relationship. I endured a lot of physical suffering from it, but I was always too scared to leave it. I live with my single mom on a rougher side of town, the place where I spent my entire childhood. Being a girl walking home alone at night here can be sketchy, which was part of the reason why I stayed with Kian for so long. He is a big guy, and I felt a sense of protection with him when he wasn't making me feel like shit. A big reason I stayed with him though towards the end was because I was scared of how he'd take it if I broke up with him. My mother always hated him though, and she knew he was no good for me. Unfortunately, it took me as long as it did to cut ties with him. I did it over text one day though, because I knew if I did it in person he'd hit me or go crazy. He still didn't take it well. Seconds after I texted him, he tried calling me over and over. I wouldn't pick up because I was scared. So after the third or fourth attempted call, he started typing for a few minutes, and the text I got from him was a long paragraph cursing me out, a lot of it in all caps. I texted him back that we could talk about it on the phone tomorrow when he's cooled off. He of course sent another paragraph, and I didn't read this one right away because I was about to cry, and I didn't want to deal with it at that moment. My mom was working her second job that night and wouldn't be home till around 2 in the morning. I had class the next day, so I went to bed early around 10, but falling asleep was difficult with my mind racing. Eventually though, I did fall asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound from the outside of my room. I looked at the clock and it was around 1 a.m. It wasn't uncommon for me to wake up to my mom getting home late at night after work. I was just surprised because she was home rather early this night. I sat up and saw something sitting on the edge of my bed. I realized it was my cat Nala. I got out of bed and went out into the hall and called my mom's name. All the lights were out. I knew for certain I heard something from out in the living room. I turned on the living room lights, but no one was here. I went to the front door to make sure it was locked, and it was. I checked through the window to the driveway, and my mom's car wasn't here, so I figured maybe I was just hearing things. I went back to my room and shut the door, then crawled back into bed. Nala was still in the same spot on my bed. She hadn't moved. I tried to go back to sleep, and I suddenly heard another sound. I ran out to the living room again, and my mom wasn't here still. I suddenly realized Kian knew where we kept the spare key in the backyard. What if he had just let himself in? I went back to my room and called my mom on my cell phone and told her. I had already texted her earlier about my breakup, so she already knew and was proud of me. She said she'd be home in a little bit, and that I could just be hearing house noises. I laid back down in my bed. Nala was still in the same position. I turned on the lamp and went to go pick her up, but I gasped when I saw her eyes lifelessly open and she wasn't breathing. I picked her up and confirmed it. My cat was dead. I wanted to cry, but I covered my mouth. I suddenly knew that Kian was in the house and that he did this to punish me. I locked my bedroom door and called 911 and whispered into the phone that my crazy ex-boyfriend broke into my house and killed my cat. I was told to wait in the closet in my bedroom until I heard the police arrive. I stayed on the phone with 911 in the closet, waiting. At any time during this, the front door to the house could have opened and closed, and I wouldn't have been able to hear it. Eventually, the 911 operator told me the police were there. Apparently, the door was unlocked because they let themselves in. That meant Kian had probably just left. I went to the living room to find 2 police officers. I was bawling my eyes out over Nala now. The first thing they asked was, "Where is he?" And I said, "I think he left." I showed them my cat and the text from Kian. My mom came home shortly after I called her, and she cried over Nala too. The police were not very helpful at all, saying without any actual evidence that someone broke into the house, they couldn't just go and arrest someone. Nala had no stab marks or anything, so as messed up as it sounds, we couldn't even prove that she was likely murdered by Kian as revenge to me. The next day, my mom had the locks to the house changed. The spare key in the backyard was still there, but Kian easily could have put it back. I blocked Kian's number and all social media outlets. All the evidence pointed to him having done it. My mother and I went through the process of getting an order of protection against him, and the judge issued us a temporary one before our court date. The last time I ever saw Kian was in court, where thankfully the judge determined that the order of protection would remain in place. I still often think about how the first time I went downstairs, Kian was probably somewhere in the living room, hiding and watching me. When I was in junior year of high school, I had my first relationship. His name was Mike. He was a senior at a different high school the next town over. We met through Facebook. He messaged me and we started talking from there. We started hanging out and going to each other's games. I'd go to his football games, he'd come to my softball games. We officially became boyfriend-girlfriend after a few weeks. Since we were in high school though, we didn't go on a lot of traditional dates like dinner or drinks. We were just kids still. Our dates usually consisted of getting burritos, going for drives, or hanging out at his place since my parents were always home and made it awkward in case we wanted to do anything. The best way I could describe Mike, he was a bit of a hothead. He was big for a 17-year-old, that's why he played football, but he didn't hang out with the jocks. He hung out more with the stoner crowd and the regular crowd. At least that's what he told me. I didn't go to the same school as him, so I didn't see who he was with during lunch. I also didn't really meet a lot of his friends. We mostly hung out just the two of us, as opposed to group things. Since he lived kind of far though, and I couldn't drive yet, it did get annoying. And truthfully, I started to develop feelings for this boy Andrew at my own school in my grade. Around the same time I felt myself losing interest in Mike. I wanted to test things out with Andrew, so one night when Mike was asking to hang out, I asked him to pick me up so we could talk. He knew right away something was off when I said that. When he picked me up, we went for a drive, and I told him that I think we should take a break. He refused to accept that I was serious, and angrily demanded to know what he did. When I told him it's just that I felt the spark wasn't there anymore, he got so mad that he punched his dashboard, leaving a big indent in it. He started yelling and scaring me, so I was about to get out of the car, but he stopped me and put his hand on my shoulder and said no, 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 and then asked me not to leave. He told me he's just angry, but that he'd drive me home. He put the car back in drive and started driving us. As we drove, he kept getting angrier, as he kept asking for more details of what he did wrong. He started blowing stop signs, and that's when I realized we weren't going in the direction of my parents' house. I asked him to pull over and let me out, and he yelled no. We were approaching some wooded area, and that's when I started getting really scared. I had never seen him like this before, but he was showing me a crazy side of himself. I got out of the car when he stopped it on the side of some quiet road. He yelled for me to come back, but I didn't. My mom came to pick me up. Mike sent me an apology text later that night that I didn't respond to. 2 nights later, I left my house to walk to Andrew's house, who I had plans to hang out with. He lived only 2 blocks away from me. On my way there, I spotted someone across the street, not too far behind me, walking about the same pace as me. They were wearing a hoodie with the hood up. I couldn't see their face. Foot traffic on our block wasn't too common, but it also wasn't super weird either. The closer I got to Andrew's house, the closer the person across the street got. As I continued up the street, I turned again and saw the person was now on the same side of the street as me. My heart started to race. I started walking faster. According to my phone, Andrew's house was coming up just on the right. I texted him to come outside please because I think I'm being followed. He replied back okay. I turned one more time as I heard the sound of shoes running on the sidewalk approaching from behind me, and I saw the guy in the black hoodie running at me. I screamed and ran as fast as I could for about 5 seconds, before seeing Andrew run to the front of his house in confusion. I turned around again and saw the guy in black running the opposite direction down the street. I keep saying the guy in black, but I know it was Mike. That guy had an identical height to him from what I could tell. A few instances happened after that, like getting calls with no caller ID and seeing Mike's car parked outside my parents' house in the middle of the night. My parents were aware of what was going on, and one day, my dad drove us over to Mike's house and knocked on the front door while I was in the car, and had a long, loud talk with Mike's parents. I lowered the windows to listen, and most notably what my dad yelled was that he doesn't care how old Mike is, that it's still harassment, and if he keeps trying to contact me in any way, that we'd get police involved. It worked. Mike stopped trying to contact me after that. For those wondering, Andrew and I ended up dating for around a year. My relationship with Mike was an early lesson in my life to watch out for red flags. I've always enjoyed late night walks. There's something about the stillness that makes everything feel simpler. I'm a welder by trade, been doing it for over 40 years now. I live alone on a big farm, just me and my dog Bosley. The house is too large for one person, but I never had the heart to downsize after my wife Maria passed away. My kids moved out years ago, and ever since cancer took her, it's just been me and Bosley. One night, after a long day in the shop, I decided to go for a walk. My property is pretty big, so just a single loop is usually enough to satisfy my craving. The air was cool, and Bosley trotted along beside me. Sometimes I think he likes me more than I like him. I've walked that loop hundreds of times, but as I was heading back toward the house, something caught my eye. I glanced up at the second-story window, the one that looks out from the bedroom Maria and I used to share. For a split second, I thought I saw something move. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring up at that window. There was no reason anyone should be in there. I hadn't been in that room in years, couldn't bring myself to. I felt my blood start to boil at the thought of some stranger breaking into my house. I wasn't going to stand for that. I rushed inside, my heart racing, and ran upstairs. The room was empty, just like I'd left it. No sign of anything out of place. I looked everywhere imaginable, but found nothing. Yes, I was pretty freaked out, but I was more angry than anything. I didn't take this kind of thing lightly. I figured I had just seen something that wasn't there. I stood there for a while, feeling foolish, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. The next night, I woke up to Bosley growling. He's a good dog, never barks unless there's something to bark at. I sat up in my bed, listening. That's when I heard creaking coming from upstairs. It could have just been the sounds of my old house, but my mind went directly to footsteps, which were coming from right above me. I'm sure you could guess which room is directly above mine. I debated grabbing my hunting rifle from downstairs, but didn't want to go that far. If it came down to it, I was fully confident that I could take whatever was up there hand to hand. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check. Again, nothing. The room was exactly the same, untouched. My anger was definitely starting to turn into anxiety at this point. Something didn't feel right in the house. The following night, I came downstairs to find the kitchen lights on. I know I turned them off before bed. I don't leave lights on. There was no question anymore. Someone was in my house. I started to panic. I called the police and told them I thought someone might be sneaking around. They came out, searched the house from top to bottom, but found nothing. They were nice about it, told me to call again if I needed them, but I could tell they didn't believe me. The next night was the worst by far. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to go upstairs and check the bedroom again. I don't know why. Maybe I thought it would settle my mind, but when I opened the door, I froze. There were clothes scattered all over the floor, Maria's clothes. I had packed them away after she died. Now they were everywhere. Something like this doesn't just happen randomly. And then I saw her. There was a woman standing in the doorway, just staring at me. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I could tell she wasn't Maria. She was too short. I don't know who she was, but she didn't belong there. I had never been so afraid in my life. Without thinking, I ran at her. She turned and bolted down the stairs and out the front door. By the time I got outside, she was gone. I searched the property with Bosley, but there was no trace of her. I didn't sleep that night. For months after that, I couldn't sleep. I was constantly on edge, convinced I heard footsteps upstairs at night. Every little noise set me off. I slept with my rifle next to my bed, terrified that I'd have to use it one night. Every little noise set me off. I debated calling my brother to come stay with me, but I wasn't going to do that. I was raised to always handle my own shit, so that's what I did. The nightmare didn't end though. One night, I was sitting in the living room when I noticed a figure standing in the yard, looking straight at me through the window. It was her again. My heart felt like it stopped. I grabbed my hunting rifle and ran outside, Bosley close behind. She was still there, just a silhouette in the moonlight, watching me. I fired a few warning shots into the air, hoping to scare her off. That was enough to get her to turn and run into the darkness, but it's not like that made me feel any better. I was literally being tormented by some random woman who was probably homeless. I couldn't even imagine why this was happening to me. I stood there for a long time, waiting to see if she'd come back. She never did. I haven't seen her since, but I know it's only a matter of time. fully prepared to defend myself, but I don't think living in perpetual anxiety like this is sustainable. Thank God for Bosley. I have no idea what I'd do without him. I'll send an update if anything happens. I work for a catering service, which means I'm on the road a lot, usually late at night. I spend most of my time lugging stuff from place to place in this massive truck the company makes me drive. It's not the worst job in the world, but the hours suck, and it's not at all what I thought I'd be doing with my life. By the time I get home, I'm either so wired from caffeine that I can't sleep, or I pass out the second I hit the bed and stay that way for 12 hours. I was driving back home one night at like 2 a.m. It was nice to be driving my own car again. As I was approaching my house, I realized I had probably had one too many Red Bulls and there was no way I'd be able to sleep. On top of that, I hadn't eaten in hours and I was starving. There's a McDonald's right off the highway about 10 minutes from my house. It's usually my first choice when it comes to late night snacks since it's just so convenient. I'm not even one to gorge myself on fast food. I just occasionally get this weird craving that only a handful of fries can satisfy. It's obviously 24/7, and I figured some comfort food would be the perfect thing to help me wind down. I don't remember exactly what time it was, but it was definitely after 2 by the time I pulled into the drive-thru. There were a few cars ahead of me, which I was actually kind of surprised by. It's not like this McDonald's was a busy spot at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. As I was sitting there impatiently, I found myself staring off into space, wondering what was taking so long. That's when I noticed something strange. There was an old, beat-up Volkswagen with its windows tinted backed into a spot in the very corner of the lot. The McDonald's itself was only accepting drive-thru orders at this hour, so it did make sense why there'd be a car in the lot. There were reserved spots on the other side for employees, so it couldn't have been one of them. I figured it was maybe just someone eating in their car, which it probably was. I myself did that from time to time, so I guess I couldn't judge. It was just an odd sight, to be completely honest. I got my food and started driving away. I didn't want to go home just yet, but I also didn't want to just sit there idling my car. I began racking my brain, trying to think of a good place to scarf down the food. I live in a pretty lush area, so there's honestly a lot of options, but I didn't want to beat around the bush too much considering how late it was. There's a massive nature preserve literally down the street from my house. It's situated on a mountain and is essentially just an enormous forest. The kicker is that there's a scenic lookout point at the peak with a view of the city. There's a road that loops around the perimeter of the preserve and will take you right to the peak, which is nice during the day. After the preserve closes, though, the road is inaccessible to cars, but still a convenient path to get to the peak without having to walk through any woods. I used to go there with my friends from high school all the time. It was kind of a default spot when we wanted to be outside. We'd hang out, talk, smoke, or just appreciate the view. I actually hadn't been there in a while because I was just so busy working all the time, so I figured going there would deliver a much-needed nostalgia rush. When I got to the preserve parking area, it was completely empty. I say parking area because it wasn't a traditional parking lot with spaces for cars, but rather a big patch of gravel that veered off from one of the roads that ran past the preserve's border. Like I said, the actual preserve was closed, meaning I'd have to walk all the way up to the lookout spot from outside. Before I could even turn off the engine, I saw headlights pulling into the lot. That was unsettling enough on its own. Who else would be here at 2 a.m.? And then I realized what I was looking at. It was that same Volkswagen from the McDonald's parking lot. I was 100% certain of it. I parked a little ways away, and the engine cut off. I felt the unease start to pour in. What were the odds of that happening naturally? Had they followed me? My window was partially rolled down, and as far as I could tell, there was no music coming from that car, or at least none that I could hear. After nothing happened for a good minute or so, my fear started to fade. They were probably doing the same thing I was, out for some fresh air or a smoke. It's a pretty popular spot for that kind of thing, but I was just so weirded out considering how late it was. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, even though I concluded that it was just one of those unexplainable coincidences. I sat there for a minute, debating if I should just go home. I didn't want to leave, but I didn't want to be alone either. I picked up my phone and FaceTimed one of my close friends who lived a few minutes away. I told myself that if he didn't pick up, I'd just eat my food in the car and drive home. He was actually awake though, which I was a little surprised by. He said he had been up writing a paper. I convinced him to swing by and hang out for a bit. He was down. He said he'd be there in 10. While I waited, I kept my eyes on the Volkswagen. It still hadn't moved. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. When Sebastian finally pulled into the lot, I felt a lot better. We both got out of our cars and began walking up the path. Before the parking lot fully receded from view, I shot a glance backwards. The Volkswagen was still there, but I saw all 4 doors open at once. 4 guys stepped out. They just stood there for a few seconds looking at each other. They weren't even talking, just looking around at each other. It was freaky. I nudged Sebastian, who realized what I was looking at. Before they could see us, we continued walking up the path so that the lot was obstructed from view. Alarm bells were going off in my head, but Sebastian didn't seem that concerned. He told me they were probably just going out to smoke. We kept walking, and by the time we got to the top, the city view was enough to take my mind off things. We always sat on this little rock wall that was supposed to keep people from wandering off the edge of the mountain. We sat there, eating and talking like we used to. It was nice. Of course, that nice feeling didn't last very long. We heard the sound of talking and laughter quickly approaching us. We turned around to see 3 guys walking towards us, sharing what looked like a blunt. They were acting friendly enough, which definitely calmed my nerves a little. Instead of finding their own spot, though, they walked right up to us like they wanted to start a conversation. The guy in the blunt was covered in tattoos and had a nose ring. He honestly looked pretty intimidating. He flashed half a smile before asking us if we wanted to smoke. We both said no, and one of the other guys laughed and called us pussies, to which Sebastian scoffed at. My curiosity got the better of me, and I blurted out a question about what they were doing at McDonald's. The guy holding the blunt dropped his smile instantly and narrowed his eyes, like he was caught off guard by my question. His 2 friends did the same, staring at us with cold expressions. They didn't say anything for an uncomfortably long time. That's when I remembered that there had been 4 guys in that car, not 3. One of them was missing. At that point, I was fully prepared to run. I knew Sebastian was thinking the same thing. Finally, the ringleader told us that he worked nights and that he had just gotten off. He pulled his hoodie up to reveal a McDonald's uniform, I think because he knew we wouldn't have believed him otherwise. He then went on to say he came to the spot every day after work to smoke with his friends. While that definitely calmed me down a bit, something about this situation was terribly off. I could tell Sebastian felt the same. We decided it was time to go. As we started walking down the path, Sebastian stopped and pointed into the trees. I followed his gaze and saw the 4th guy, half hidden in the darkness. He was holding something, but I couldn't make out what it was. I felt my heart start racing. The moment he saw us looking, he started moving. That's when we ran. We bolted down the path, glancing back to see him chasing us with the 3 other guys close behind. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I could hear their footsteps getting closer, but I didn't look back again. We finally made it to the parking lot, jumped into our cars, and floored it out of there. As I was speeding away, I could see those guys rushing to get in their car. I didn't feel comfortable driving home out of fear that I'd be leading them right to my house. I called Sebastian and told him we should meet back up on his street. We had a decent head start on them, and I don't think we were followed, but I wasn't taking any chances. When Sebastian and I met back up, we were still in shock about what the hell just happened. I don't know if they were trying to rob us or worse. I didn't know what to think. Sebastian showed me his phone and said he had snuck a picture of them while they weren't looking. He sent it to me, but I wasn't sure what to even do with it. I had off the next day, so I convinced Sebastian to come with me back to the McDonald's so we could at least report the employee. The next day, we approached a guy on the younger side in hopes that he'd listen to us. We showed him the picture and told him what happened, and his eyes widened. He told us something literally out of a horror movie. Apparently, that guy's girlfriend had also worked at that same McDonald's and had dumped him a few months ago. He didn't take it well and would harass her while she was working and stalk her after her shifts. He obviously got fired, but that didn't help. The police were involved shortly after, and there was a restraining order put in place. Apparently, he had been violating that restraining order because he was camping out in the parking lot. Sebastian and I were horrified. I have no idea why he'd decide to follow me, but it was clear that he was unhinged. I'm praying that the police catch him camping out in the parking lot, because then he'll actually be screwed. I just hope he doesn't recognize my car anywhere. It's only been a week, but I haven't been back to that McDonald's or the preserves since. Hopefully the police are able to do something, but that's out of my control. Forgive me if I don't remember every detail of the story. It happened a while ago. I grew up in Ardmore, Pennsylvania. Not much goes on around here, so finding things to do can be a challenge. In high school, a few friends and I would sneak into and explore old, abandoned buildings. That's the sort of thing we did at that age. I didn't realize how popular that kind of stuff is until many years later. Apparently, lots of people like to explore abandoned buildings. Anyway, there was this abandoned church that we'd been to a couple of times before. It was in Narberth. I actually remember the exact address, 198 Elmwood Avenue. The place was creepy, but it was kind of our go-to spot for late-night thrills. One fall evening, a few of us decided to hit the church and drink a little inside. It was a chilly night, and the air had that crisp bite to it. There were 6 of us: me, Luna, Gina, Johnny, Max, and Allie. The church sat behind an 8-foot chain-link fence, which we had to climb to get in. The doors were all boarded up, so we always went through a window on the side. Once you were inside, the first thing you noticed was the floor, or lack of one. The entire first floor was just dirt. It looked like someone had ripped out the floorboards years ago, leaving only a hole in the center where a set of concrete stairs led down to the basement. That's where we always ended up, down in the basement. The basement had 3 rooms, but only one had a door. The other 2 just had door frames. The first room we went into was the largest. There wasn't much in it, just some old furniture, broken chairs, a busted couch. I remember having to shush Johnny like 12 times because he was a lightweight, and the tiny bit of alcohol he had was making him really loud and antsy. Being in such a big group was always a plus though, and I felt much safer knowing we had numbers. We messed around for a while, drinking and laughing like we usually did. We might have had a speaker playing music, but I don't fully remember. Out of nowhere, a door slammed. I literally jumped. That's how loud it was. We froze, staring at each other with concerned expressions. At first, I thought one of us had closed the door by accident, but no one was near it. Almost immediately, Luna, Gina, and Johnny made a break for it, sprinting up the stairs, leaving me, Max, and Allie behind. We were the fearless ones, and none of us wanted to leave just yet. My heart was definitely pounding, I fully admit that, but I wasn't going to let the wind freak me out. I could tell Max and Allie were thinking the same thing. I don't know if it was curiosity or stupidity, but we decided to investigate. After standing in silence for a few minutes, the 3 of us crept over to open the door that had slammed shut. Behind it was a small room, and the first thing I saw was a dresser. The mirror on top of it was cracked, and there were red stains smeared across the surface. At first, I thought it was old paint or something, but when I got closer, I realized something terrifying. It wasn't completely dry. The stains still had that sticky sheen to them, like whatever it was hadn't been there for long. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up, and I was having second thoughts about not leaving sooner. Someone, or dare I say something, had recently been in this room. Then I saw the picture. There was an old photo on top of the dresser, a black and white shot of a woman in a wedding dress. She was smiling, but there was something off about it. The whole thing gave me a bad feeling. I backed away, but just as I turned, we heard another noise. This time, it wasn't the door. It was coming from one of the other rooms. It was coming from the room we had just been in. That's when Max and Allie both decided they'd had enough. I wasn't going to argue with them. We grabbed our stuff and ran out of there as fast as we could. When we climbed back over the fence and hit the pavement, none of us said a word. After jumping the fence, I turned around, and I could swear I saw the silhouette of a person standing in the open window. I still pray that by some minuscule chance my mind was just playing tricks on me, but I'll never know for sure. My friends and I never went back there together for as long as we remained friends. I've actually been back to that church myself, although it wasn't a church anymore. By the time I got around to checking it out again, it was completely demolished. I still have no idea what we saw that night. I'm just glad my friends were there to witness it with me. Had I been alone, I might doubt this whole thing even happened. If anyone wants to do some digging, go ahead. I was never able to find out anything online, but I wouldn't be surprised if that church has a history I don't know about. I went to a bar with a couple friends one Saturday night. We got really drunk and eventually all spread out throughout the bar as we went to talk to different people. Long story short, I was having a bad night, and I wasn't feeling the whole bar scene really. I called an Uber home, which was about 15 minutes away. The Uber pulled up, but instead some old, crappy-looking 2003 or something Honda Accord pulls up in front of the bar. I knocked on the window and asked, "Mike?" He nodded, so I got in the passenger seat, only because the front seat was covered with books and other stuff that appeared to be junk. In fact, the entire car was messy, the back seats too. He didn't seem like the kind of Uber driver to joke around and make conversation with. He was on the older side, not that old, but his hair was thinning, and based on what I could see of his face, he looked kind of unfriendly. So I kept silent. I was pretty drunk though, so I barely remember what I was doing, probably drunk texting people and whatnot. I'm telling you, I was blackout drunk because I don't remember even getting out of the car. All I really remember is waking up the next morning and realizing my phone was missing. I checked everywhere. I practically turned my whole room upside down looking for it. Eventually, after hours of searching, I came to the unfortunate acceptance that I must have lost my phone the night before. I had my brother text all my friends asking if they had my phone. All of them said no. Then I remembered I recently activated Find My iPhone. I excitedly told my brother to track my phone using the Find My iPhone app. Sure enough, my iPhone came up on the map. It was a few miles away, on the much worse side of town, the part of town everyone knew not to go to. My brother agreed to come with me, not only to help track the phone, but to serve as backup if needed. We pulled up to what appeared to be the house that the iPhone on the map was sitting over. It was a small box-like house. 2 windows in front, 1 window on the upper level. It was either 8 or 9 p.m., still early, so my brother and I went ahead and rang the doorbell. It didn't seem like the bell worked though, so I knocked really hard on the door. We could actually hear footsteps on a creaky wood floor approaching the front door, then silence. There was a peephole in the door, so I had a feeling someone was watching us through it at that very moment. After an uncomfortably long silence, the door cracked open and someone asked who it is in a very raspy, almost familiar voice. We mentioned the lost iPhone situation. At first he played dumb, but when I turned to the driveway and recognized the old Honda Accord, I called him out for being my Uber driver and that I must have dropped my phone in his car. At this point he opened the door fully and revealed himself to indeed be my Uber driver. Now he acted like he remembered, but his whole persona and everything was disturbing. He clearly didn't know what social cues were, or forget that, he clearly just didn't know what social skills were. He told us to come in and shut the door behind us. Then he told us to wait there while he went upstairs to find my phone. I thanked him, and as creepy as the guy was, I felt relieved that I'd be getting my phone back. My brother and I stood in the tiny hallway of this man's tiny house. It was so archaic inside. The finishing, the design, everything. The floral wallpaper covering all of the walls looked like it belonged in a house built in the 1930s. The stairs that the man walked up were creaky and sounded like they were ready to collapse. We heard the man walking around upstairs for a bit. The creakiness followed his every step until we heard him stop directly overhead. My brother and I patiently played the waiting game, with my checking my watch every minute or so. He seemed to be up there for a total of 10 minutes. My brother and I got so impatient at this point that we started calling up the stairs asking the man if he needed help. We heard a slight creak in the floor right above us again, but he didn't call back. My brother told me to go upstairs and check if he needed help, so I hesitantly did. As I got halfway up the stairs, I realized it was insanely dark up there, which made me wonder how he could even possibly be looking for my phone. I got to the top. There seemed to be 3 open doors, one leading to a bathroom, the other 2 leading to bedrooms. All the lights were off except for a little hallway nightlight. I called out for the man again, to no avail. I called down the stairs to my brother, saying that all the lights were off and something wasn't right. He didn't answer for some reason. I checked the bathroom, empty. I was about to check one of the bedrooms, passing the door to the bathroom, but I stopped when I saw something through the crack of the bathroom door. The man, he was hiding behind the door, holding something in his hand. I felt like he was looking at me, but I didn't look for more than a second. I looked away and pretended I didn't notice. I had to get downstairs ASAP. I nervously called out to the man that I'd be going downstairs and that I'd be right back. I walked with a certain speed and jumped my step right to the stairs, at which point I booked it and screamed for my brother to follow me. My brother emerged from one of the other rooms downstairs after apparently snooping around, and without questioning it, followed me outside to the car. We drove down the block as I explained in full what happened. The next thing we did was dial 911 for the police. An officer showed up to the house where we returned, showed the officer the Find My iPhone app screen, and knocked on the door with the officer. The man would eventually answer, and the officer forced the man to fetch the phone. This time he did without hesitation. He went up the stairs and 10 seconds later came back down. My brother and I begged the officer to arrest him or do something, given that he looked as if he were waiting to strike me as he was behind that door. The officer said there was nothing he could do though, and I swear as I said this, the Uber driver looked at me with the most disgusting, disturbing, and evil stare I'd ever seen. I gave him the middle finger and turned away as we left the house, which felt good slightly, but I still get scared thinking about seeing that man behind that door, very clearly holding something in his hand, most likely waiting to attack me if I were to see him. Before I got an iPhone 10, I used to have an iPhone 7. I was perfectly fine with that phone and I never got a scratch on it. I'd probably still have that phone now if I didn't lose it. I always had the Find My iPhone feature enabled, however, just in case if I did lose it, I'd be able to track it. To this day, I still don't remember how or where I lost the phone. All I remember is I came home one day, quickly realized I didn't have my phone on me, and had a mini heart attack. I searched the whole house, my car, the pathway up to the house. I even drove back to all the locations I was in that night to look for it, but I couldn't find it anywhere. Then I remembered I could sign into my iCloud account from my laptop and track my iPhone using the Find My iPhone setting. So I drove home and did just that. Apparently my phone was coming up somewhere in the woods at the end of the village. None of my siblings were home at the time. They were all away at school, so I couldn't ask any of them to come with me. So it looked like I was heading out alone. My dad didn't want me to come because he had work early the next morning, but he let me take his phone with me to track my phone. It was a quick 5 to 10 minute drive to the woods. I parked on the grass on the side of the road. It seemed like I was maybe a minute walk north away. Obviously I brought my flashlight expecting to be following the trail into the woods. Now that I stood there though, the idea of going in there was a lot less appealing. In fact, the whole situation seemed more suspicious, such as why whoever found my phone would be in the middle of the dark woods at 10 o'clock. I definitely shouldn't have come alone, but at this point I didn't see much more of a choice than following the trail. The flashlight I had sucked. It barely lit up the trail 5 feet in front of me. Eventually it seemed like I was right on the mark of the location for my phone. I did a full 360 examining my surroundings, but seeing nothing but darkness and trees. I started yelling for somebody to come out. It was the first time I heard my own voice in an hour, and it came out weak and unintimidating. When I called out, I heard a whispering come from beyond a few trees, in the east direction on my map. I yelled out again. Silence this time now. I started sending texts with my dad's phone to my phone, and I heard the dings coming from the same direction as the whispering. I looked in that direction and saw the glow of a phone screen so bright that it lit up the figures of 2, maybe 3 men standing behind a line of trees. At that exact moment, I had a realization in my head that I was in way over my head being in those woods alone, and that my iPhone was in no way worth risking my life. I turned the flashlight off and ran back down the trail as fast as I could, back to my car. By the time I got back, my phone could no longer be located on the Find My iPhone app, meaning it was either broken, disconnected, or turned off. I have checked a few times since then if the phone comes up on the map. It never has though. I think I made the right choice running away. I don't think any possession would be worth approaching a group of people like that in the woods. I recently lost my iPhone. It was a 5C, a really old one. I was due for another one anyway, but let me tell you the story of how I lost it. I had admittedly been drinking one night on the weekends, and at some point in the night I lost my phone. Later on in the night, when my friends and I sobered up a bit, I asked one of my friends to let me use their phone to track mine using the Find My iPhone thing. It wasn't too far actually, only a mile away from us, but that meant someone took my phone. My friend Ryan and I took a drive to this abandoned warehouse building. Of course, it had to be an abandoned building. We found a way inside, with only Rye's phone flashlight to use for navigation. The place was cold, full with trash and rubble, and every little sound created an echo. We heard yelling coming from upstairs, from what sounded like two people. Ryan and I figured one of them had to have my phone, so still, with a slight amount of liquid confidence in us, we found a stairway that led to the next level. We came to a hallway, which was disturbingly silent. The only thing to break the silence was a bang from a nearby locker room type area. Ryan and I both tried hard to make our presence known so that we wouldn't surprise any potentially dangerous people. We entered this kind of changing room area, or whatever it was, but it had a bunch of lockers. No one was in the room. Rye started checking the lockers out of desperation, which made a lot of noise, I guess, because we heard a deep voice from another room call us over and said that they had what we were looking for. I was about to walk into the adjacent room, but Rye put his hand on my shoulder to stop me and put his finger on his lips as he went, "Shh." He was doing something on his phone. I didn't know what until I heard my ringtone and the vibration of my phone coming from one of the lockers. There were too many to distinguish quick enough which one it could be. I started checking the ones where the sound could have been coming from before Rye pulled me by the arm and told me, "Let's go." I told him, "Wait, let me get my phone first," but he kept saying, "No, let's go." By the time we got to the car, we had a long discussion about what was going down in there, or what was about to go down. Rye was positive we were walking straight into a trap. How he was so sure was because as I was checking the lockers for my phone, he spotted someone's head behind one of the walls to the adjacent room. They were peering their head in just barely, making it obvious they were hiding and had questionable intentions. It wasn't the end of the world. It was an old iPhone that wouldn't have been worth much anyway. It was much better to escape with our wallets, or even our lives instead. I once worked as a direct care aide for a 65-year-old woman with a developmental disability. Her daughter, who was in her 40s, worked overnights, and she needed a caretaker with medical experience to watch her overnight. When I say once worked for them, I mean I literally worked once, just this night, and you're about to hear why I never went back. The 65-year-old woman's name was Martha. Her daughter's name, who contacted me, was named Colleen. It's possible Colleen didn't have any other family to watch her and didn't want to or couldn't afford to put Martha in a nursing home. Or it was possible that she felt more comfortable hiring somebody with some form of experience to watch over her. At the time, I was already a direct care worker for 2 other women who suffered some forms of developmental disabilities, so I had experience. But nothing prepared me for that night. Colleen left for work. Earlier that day, I worked my first job, so I was really pushing my body to exhaustion, trying to make as much money as possible. Colleen had introduced Martha and I. Martha had given me a smile before Colleen brought her upstairs to her bedroom for the night. It was around 9 p.m. Colleen told me that Martha would sometimes walk around the house at night acting confused, and I'd need to calm her down and bring her back to her room. She specifically addressed this not to be a form of sleepwalking when I asked. She said it's one of the symptoms of her mother's dementia. I told her to rest assured that I'd know how to handle it. I spent my time initially in the living room catching up on my show. These jobs aren't super glamorous, and for the most part, it is a lot of sitting around. I heard footsteps from upstairs. I went to the stairway and looked up the stairs, then called Martha's name asking if she needed anything. She didn't answer. I heard her footsteps go back to her room, and then the door closed. Maybe she went to the bathroom. I went back to the living room and watched some more TV. It was maybe an hour later that I got up to grab my sandwich that I brought from the fridge. As I left the kitchen with a plate and my sandwich to go back to the couch, I nearly had a heart attack and dropped the plate when I saw Martha standing at the doorway. Glass shattered everywhere. I apologized to her and asked if she was okay. She started yelling at me, "Who are you?" I reminded her who I am. I'm her direct care worker here to make sure she's okay. Everything she said at this point was in a loud scream. "Why are you here? I don't know you," things of that nature. I reminded her that we had just met, and that her mother Colleen hired me to watch her and the house. This seemed to work for long enough for me to get her to come back upstairs with me and to her room. I brought her up a glass of water and some melatonin and clonazepam. I made sure she took both before going back downstairs. After a few hours, I was absolutely exhausted. I had to get a couple hours of shut-eye. There was a spare bedroom upstairs with a twin-size bed where Colleen said I could rest if needed. I felt like at this point Martha was asleep for the night from the melatonin. I fell asleep within minutes, but I was asleep for only maybe an hour. I woke up to a sound from downstairs. It was this repeated slamming. Every 1 to 2 seconds, something from downstairs was being slammed. I jumped out of the bed. I had left the bedroom door open so that I'd hear anything if Martha got up. Case in point right here. When I got to the stairs, I realized the slamming was coming from the kitchen. I walked down the stairs in as quick of a speed as I could while still remaining quiet. Getting to the bottom, I peered around the opening to the kitchen, and what I saw was like a scene from a scary movie I'd seen before. I saw Martha in the darkness, standing in front of the oven, repeatedly opening it and slamming it shut. It was horrifying. When I say I saw Martha, I really only saw her silhouette. It was that dark in the kitchen. I said "Martha" really loudly, and she stopped, turned to her left at me, shut the oven door one final time, and started walking towards me, towards the stairs. I said in a now softer, kind of scared-sounding voice, "Are you okay?" She got close enough to me where I could now see her facial features, and she looked at me with this blank expression, then walked right past me and started walking up the stairs. I followed her upstairs, but as soon as she got to her room, she slammed her door shut. I knocked on the door saying, "Martha, are you alright?" She didn't respond. I quietly opened the door just to peek inside, and I saw Martha at the side of her bed, just standing facing the wall. I've seen a lot, but this was some pretty unsettling behavior that I feel like is the exact kind of stuff you'd see in some scary movies, like I mentioned before. I walked over to her and gently eased her into the bed. When she was laying down, I covered her, and for what I was hoping would be the final time, I said "Goodnight, Martha," and shut her door. I went across the upstairs to the spare room and went back to bed. I purposely tried not to fall asleep for at least half an hour just in case she'd wake up again, but I don't even know if I made it that long. All I know is I fell asleep pretty freaking quickly. I woke up once again, however much later. The room was still pitch black, and the 1-hour alarm I set had not yet gone off. I looked around the room, wondering what woke me up. I didn't see what it was until I heard a sound from inside the closet. I then noticed the cracked open closet door, and the black shadow of a head peeking out of the closet. Again, I almost had a heart attack. I said "Martha." She didn't answer. I kept saying "Martha" a bunch of times until she pushed the door open, and I saw her approaching the bed slowly. She started saying what she was saying hours ago again. "Who are you? I don't know you." As she got closer, I tried calming her down, reminding her who I am. I reached for the lamp next to the bed and fumbled with it until it turned on. Martha was holding a huge kitchen knife in her hand. At this moment, everything changed. Martha was now a threat to my life, and I had to worry about myself, not her. I screamed at this point, "Martha, put the knife down." I guess my scream stressed her out because she got closer and started screaming back at me, still repeating, "I don't know you." I wasn't going to attempt to calm down a knife-wielding dementia patient. That was not in any job description. I mapped out a way to run around her in the bedroom, and I went for it. I jumped off the bed on the side further from her, and she screamed again, "Who are you?" She swung the knife at the air as I ran past her. It was a slow and weak swipe from what I saw, but nonetheless showed that she had intentions of actually using it. I got downstairs and grabbed my shoes and went outside. Instead of calling 911, I called Colleen as she requested I do if there's an issue. I was courteous in doing this because getting law enforcement involved is never doing anyone any favors. Colleen was yelling into the phone at me not to leave her, and honestly I yelled back that she attempted to kill me and that I didn't call the police. She had to leave work, of course. I stayed outside of the house, making sure Martha didn't go anywhere until Colleen returned. When Colleen went inside, Martha was back in her bed asleep. Colleen went as far as accusing me of exaggerating the whole thing until she found the knife next to Martha's bed. To not give her any more fuel to blame me for any of this, I left out the fact that I ever went to sleep. But that doesn't mean that I felt in any way I did anything wrong. Colleen even offered me that room to sleep. I never worked in that house again. Martha was a scarier patient than I'd ever dealt with in any of my jobs in my 9 years of being a direct care aide. It was my first day working for this plumbing company. I was called in for my first job to this house out of town. The plumbing company had 5 employees, and the owner would choose who does what job. I don't see it as a coincidence that I was sent to some undesirable job far away in a shitty area for my first job. The call was for a leaky pipe under the sink, which is typically the easiest, most basic job to get a call for, depending on the root cause of it. I pulled up to the house, my first ever call, and it was an absolutely disgusting looking house, completely run down as if no one had lived there for years. I went up to the house and knocked until a middle-aged man opened the door. I didn't like his aura from the start. He had this unflattering, disproportionately wide smile that made his entire face appear off-putting. His voice was also really soft and high-pitched, not the voice I was expecting to come out of his mouth. Or maybe it was, given his unusual appearance. He welcomed me inside of the house. I realized there wasn't a single piece of furniture in the house. "Just moved in?" I asked him. He replied yes and then chuckled. Or maybe I should say he giggled because it was just a weird, high-pitched little laugh. He brought me to the kitchen, and the first thing I did was set my stuff down on the counter, then open the cabinets under the sink. I slid myself under the sink and started to examine the pipe, specifically looking at the P-trap and the lock nuts to make sure they weren't overly tight or loose. I noticed the man was standing directly over me, his legs spread wide so that I was sandwiched between both of his feet. It was extremely uncomfortable. I asked him politely to give me some space, and he backed up a bit, but not enough that would make me feel comfortable. I realized that I didn't see any water leaking at all, so I got out from under the sink and tried running the water, but no water came out of the faucet. I looked at the weird man and asked him why the water wasn't running. He said he must have shut off the main water valve without realizing it. When I say I stood there speechless for a few seconds, I'm not exaggerating. I asked him bluntly, "How do you do something like that by mistake?" He smiled and shrugged his shoulders. I asked him to go turn the water valve back on. He turned and said he'd be right back, and I saw him leave the kitchen, but then I heard footsteps walking upstairs. I'd never in my life heard of a water valve being upstairs in any house. I knew something was off with this guy and the situation. Everything from the condition of this house to his mannerisms. And then I started hearing multiple sets of footsteps from upstairs, coming down the steps quickly. In a split second, I decided I was out of there. I grabbed my stuff and quickly walked out to the front door and to my van. I'm a pretty large and loud dude, so I'm not really intimidated very easily by people in a physical way. But there was something about that situation and that guy that told me that some shit was about to go down. I looked at the house for a second, and then I drove away. I called Dave, my boss, letting him know it was just some kind of prank, because that just sounded better than me saying I was scared of that guy. I did a few minutes worth of investigating and found out that that was just a vacant, abandoned house. I got the number that made the call for the alleged leaky pipe from Dave, and it turned out to be a voice over IP number, not even a real number. I reported this shady encounter with the local police department just so that they would be aware of it and maybe close off that house. I've never had a reason to return to that sketchy part of town again. I only worked for that specific plumbing company for about a year. Back in 2019, I worked for Domino's. It was my first night. I was just starting out. I was only working there because I needed the money for college, supplies for my dorm, etc. And so that night I was being trained. When you're being trained, you're accompanied by the manager on your first few deliveries to see how you do and evaluate you and train you. It was late, around 8 o'clock, and we got an order. Our store wasn't electronic like they are today. We couldn't see where the locations were on a big TV. We had to go look them up on our phones for directions. We got the directions and the pizza. I still remember the order. 4 large pizzas with 2 bottles of Pib. We load them into the car, and it was my car since I was the one being evaluated. So it was me, my manager, and another trainee who I didn't know. The house we were heading towards was way out of the way in the middle of nowhere. My town was old though, so it was fairly common to go miles without anything. It took us around 15 to 20 minutes to get there. The house looked old, really old. It was an old 2-story home and it was completely run down. The wood was chipping, some of the windows had boards on them. It was not a house you'd expect people to be living in. I remember asking my manager if we had to go up there, and he told both of us yes, but that he'd come with us and hand them the pizzas and sodas. I hesitantly got out of the car and noticed that the other guy who was new was very nervous as well about walking to that front door. We finally started making our way to it when the other trainee said he thought he saw someone watching us from the furthest window from us, upstairs. Our manager told him he's just paranoid and that this shouldn't take more than a minute or two, making sure to tell us to stay calm and be nice. I don't know how I had the courage to ring the bell, but I did, which of course didn't work. So my manager pounded on the door. No answer. We waited about 15 seconds and knocked again, harder this time. Still no answer. We were all getting impatient, and there was a smell of something rotten. We couldn't tell if it was the house or if something inside had died. Finally, after about a minute of impatiently waiting, someone opens the door, but not completely. They open the door only showing part of their face and asking who we were and what we wanted. My manager said we had their pizza, and the guy quickly unlocked the door and acted all friendly towards us. It freaked the 3 of us out. It was an older gentleman, in his 50s at least. He told us it took him a while to open the door because it's hard for him to get around or some shit. Our manager handed him the receipt and asked if he was paying with cash or a check, and the man told us he'd be back with the money. He left the front door open, so I looked around to see what the house looked like inside. Empty. Completely empty. No furniture or anything in that house. Just the floor and a couple of blankets. Obviously this guy was homeless and was just living here since no one else was. That's when we heard footsteps coming from upstairs. More than one person too. That's when we got uncomfortable about the situation. The realization of what the other employee said became true. Someone was probably watching us as we walked to the front door. My manager yelled out if the man had the money yet, but he never got a response back. The footsteps stopped. Everything just stopped. It became silent. You could just hear the 3 of us breathing. My manager told us to stay at the front door in case the man came back, and that he'd go around the house to see if the man needed help or something. We nodded at him and he walked towards the back. The 2 of us heard footsteps, but not from upstairs. They were coming from below us somehow. We both looked completely puzzled and confused, and honestly uneasy about this entire situation. That's when we heard our manager scream and heard frantic running. He ran to the front of the house where both of us were and told us to go back into the car and that we're leaving. I've never driven a car faster in my life. My manager explained to us that when he was walking around to the back, he saw a group of people in the darkness surrounding a sort of makeshift campfire, but it was very small. He got closer to them and noticed in the middle was a baby deer. The group of men were sitting around laughing at it as if they found it funny. The minute he said that, my heart almost stopped. The new guy and I quit right after, and I heard the manager quit a month after this. I'd never worked a delivery job again. Obviously, we walked into some kind of cult meeting, and I'm just glad we left when we did. There's this lake that my brother and I used to fish. We'd use live bait, usually crickets or worms, and we'd catch a ton of bluegill. It was a fun time, and some of those early memories are the reason I've been such an avid fisherman for most of my life. The lake wasn't the most popular fishing spot, despite being pretty well stocked from what I can remember. I think most of the locals just found it inconvenient and inaccessible unless you were prepared to hike through the woods a bit, which my brother and I always were. The seclusion was actually one of my favorite things about it, almost like I was sharing a private activity that not everyone got to experience. Everyone knows the best lake fishing happens during periods of low light, meaning early morning or late evening. It's more customary to wake up at the crack of dawn and get out early, but my brother and I developed this habit of going out later in the day and staying into the night. It was our substitute for whatever most high school kids did at that time of night on the weekend, probably partying and whatnot. It was a Friday night, and everything was going according to plan. We reached the lake just as the sun started to set, and by the time we were all baited up, the sun was already starting to dip. We were positioned at the edge of the lake on this little formation of rocks that made a good comfortable surface for us and all our excess gear. It was something we had done hundreds of times. As we were fishing though, something caught my eye on the far side of the lake. There was movement in the water, and by the sheer rippling of it, I was surprised it had taken me so long to notice. I pointed it out to JJ, and the two of us strained our eyes in confusion, wondering what was causing it. Keep in mind, this lake was pretty sizable, and when coupled with the low visibility, it wasn't like you could see perfectly clearly across it. But then, as we were both looking at the ripples in the water, something happened that I would have never expected, not in a million years. A dark mass started rising out of the water where the ripples had been, and as it emerged, my assumption that it had been a huge fish was immediately dispelled. It was not a fish. It was way too big and way too upright. There was only one explanation, really. I think my brother and I realized it at the same time, because I heard him curse at the same time I did. It was a person. Think about how strange that is on its own. Not only was there a literal person in a somewhat private lake after sunset, but they had just been submerged below the surface. And not just that, they must have been down there for quite some time too, otherwise we would have noticed them earlier. It was freaky enough to quicken my heartbeat a little, and I got this compelling urge to leave. My brother didn't want to though, saying that we had just gotten out there, and that person in the lake was too far away to have any kind of effect on us. I figured he wasn't wrong, so the two of us spent the next few minutes watching the person in the lake, trying to rationalize the sight. They were swaying back and forth, rhythmically, almost hypnotically. Their movements weren't jerky or choppy, but perfectly fluid, like they were commanding the water around them as opposed to merely cutting through it. Our fishing poles were all but neglected at that point, lying there untouched while the two of us kept our attention fixated on the strange sight across the lake. Was it possible they were fishing? No, that seemed ridiculous. Fishing underwater? Unheard of. JJ suggested that maybe they were enjoying a night swim, which was plausible, until I grazed the surface of the lake with my hand and instantly recoiled at how cold it was. You'd have to be a psycho to enjoy swimming in temperatures that low. Without much else to do besides ignore them and keep fishing, I snapped out of my trance and encouraged my brother to do the same. But when I looked over at him, I realized that he was either much more invested or much more scared than I was, maybe both. Instead of heeding my advice, he sat there motionlessly with his lips slightly parted and his eyes glued to the lake. He wasn't even holding his fishing pole anymore. I said his name a few times in frustration before he finally averted his gaze, instinctively picking his fishing pole back up. With a little shake of his hand, he said sorry, and the two of us tried to resume fishing, although it was pretty clear that our attention was elsewhere. I'm not really sure what I expected to happen. I guess I figured that person would eventually get out of the lake or notice us, or do something other than just stand there. After a few minutes of mindlessly casting and reeling, JJ tapped my shoulder and said, "Look." I looked back across the lake just in time to see that person submerge again, disappearing below the surface. I found myself staring at the spot they had just been, expecting them to reappear any second, but they didn't. A minute passed, and then another. It dawned on me that JJ had his phone out with the stopwatch running. As it ticked up past 2 minutes, I grew increasingly astonished at how long they were holding their breath. JJ theorized that maybe it was someone training, and I almost laughed at the thought of an Olympic diver testing their lung capacity out there, in a freezing cold lake in the middle of nowhere after the sun had set. Suddenly, the thought wasn't so funny anymore, and I started packing up, telling JJ we were leaving. But he held me back, saying he wanted to wait and see how long they could hold their breath for. I told him fine, but gathered up our stuff anyway, feeling that urge to leave start creeping back in. Just before the 3-minute mark, I noticed ripples in the water again, only this time they were much, much closer, 1/5 of the way out instead of all the way on the other side. The realization that this person had not only held their breath for nearly 3 minutes, but had done so while swimming was enough for me to raise my voice at JJ. This time he didn't argue, and the two of us stood up, preparing to leave. But we couldn't go just yet. The curiosity was far too strong. JJ and I watched as the person started emerging again, and this time we could see them clear as day. To my utter surprise, it was actually a woman, not a man like I had anticipated. She had long brown hair and was wearing what looked like a dark green swimsuit. And there was one more thing I need to mention. She was kind of beautiful. She didn't look much older than we were, maybe a year or two if I had to guess. The moment I saw her, I instantly felt less intimidated, less scared too. I started wondering if maybe my brother and I had been too hasty with our intention to leave. The two of us were still frozen in place though, and she was actually the one who broke the silence. She flashed an alluring smile and said, "Hi," almost like she was trying to be playful and coy, like she hadn't just held her breath for 3 minutes while swimming through a freezing cold lake. She was definitely a strong swimmer. It was obvious from the way she bobbed around, seeming just as comfortable in the water as most people would on land. I was dumbfounded, too perplexed to speak, but my brother blurted out the question I was dying to ask. He asked her what she was doing, and I had to remind myself that she was behaving like a crazy person, as harmless as she looked. She leaned her head back and said she was swimming. My brother said, "Well, yeah, obviously," then asked her if she was training for something. She gave us another teasing smile and said something like that, then glided a little closer to us. Then she actually asked us if we wanted to join her. Pure insanity. I spoke up for the first time, asking her if she was crazy and telling her the water was freezing. She laughed and called us bitches, then said we'd get used to the temperature fast. JJ said no, and she started glaring at us with a finger on her lip like she was thinking. I don't know if it was her cavalier attitude or the icy look in her eye, but the alarm bell started ringing, and I was terrified all over again. There were so many things I wanted to ask her. Who was she? Was she alone? How long had she been out there? Did she live nearby? But I didn't. Instead, I just grabbed JJ's shoulder and told the pretty lake girl we were leaving. I'm not sure what I was expecting her to do, but I definitely wasn't expecting her to start screaming. She screamed no at the top of her lungs, and I stumbled backwards out of pure shock. My brother and I made sure we weren't leaving any of our stuff behind and then started running away from the lake. She kept screaming after us though. She was yelling for us to come back and get in the water. As if that wasn't horrifying enough, she just started shrieking at one point. Not words, just shrieking. It sounded like someone being stabbed. I could still hear her behind us by the time we were halfway back to the car. Part of me was expecting her to get out of the water and start chasing us, but I don't know if she ever did. By the time we made it back to the car, JJ already had the police on the line. He told them what had happened, and even though they asked us to stay nearby so they could question us, he told them he didn't feel comfortable doing that, then hung up. I probably would have done the same thing. That's how badly I wanted to get out of there. You might think the experience would have discouraged my brother and I from continuing to fish there, and it did, but only for a while. We actually did go back a fair amount, though for the first handful of outings we made sure to bring our dad with us. It took some convincing to get him to believe us, but he ultimately did. He was pretty curious and wanted to see this strange girl for himself, but we never saw her again. For all we knew, the police had found her and dealt with her however they decided to. It became somewhat of a shared joke between my brother and I. It actually got to a point where every time we fished that lake, a little part of us wanted to see her again. But now that more time's passed, and that lake is no longer part of my life, I've begun to recognize the strangeness and horror of it all. She was probably just mentally ill. That's the explanation I ultimately decided on. My brother has some interesting theories of his own, but I find them all silly and unrealistic. Either way, I doubt anything as unexplainable and as strange as what happened that night will ever happen to me again. My name's Jay, and fishing is one of life's greatest pleasures. I take every opportunity I can to get out on the water, whether it's a lake, river, or the marshes down here in Louisiana. This happened about 2 months ago when I was out with my friend Angel, who's just as obsessed with fishing as I am. We decided to go marsh fishing for speckled trout, something we'd done plenty of times before. The marshes around here are pretty shallow, so we took out my 2-person kayak like we always do. It was early spring, so it was still pretty cold outside, and the water was even colder, but we didn't care. We'd been paddling for about 30 minutes when we found a good spot that looked promising. The marsh seemed completely empty that day, no other fishermen around, which was exactly how we liked it. We cracked open a couple of beers and got right to the fishing, just enjoying the peace and quiet. We'd been fishing for maybe an hour when Angel hooked something decent, at least from the looks of it. As he was reeling it in, he got a little too excited and leaned over the side of the kayak to get a better angle. I knew what was about to happen the second before it did, but I couldn't speak up in time. As he was leaning over, I watched helplessly as his phone slid out of his jacket pocket and plunged into the muddy water. Safe to say, Angel was frustrated as hell. He said he had insurance that would cover damage to his phone, but not if it was completely lost. He said the replacement would cost several $100s that he didn't have, and I didn't fault him for it one bit. I'm not exactly drowning in cash myself. I told him we'd try to find it, even though the water was so murky you couldn't see more than a few inches down. We spent the next 20 minutes in that same area using our paddles to try and feel something hard on the bottom, but it was hopeless. The marsh bottom was all mud and vegetation, and even though both of us had seen the phone fall into the water, we started second-guessing where we should even be looking. Finally, I told Angel we weren't going to find it and we might as well try to salvage some enjoyment from the day, but he shook his head and said he wasn't leaving without that phone. Before I could stop him, Angel started taking off his shoes and pants. He said he was going to wade into the marsh and try to feel around for the phone with his feet. I thought it wasn't a half-bad idea, actually. At least it was better than poking around with paddles. The moment Angel stepped into the water, he let out a string of curses about how cold it was. That spot of the marsh was actually deeper than I'd expected, about 4.5 feet judging by where the water came up on Angel's body. But he was determined, so he started feeling around with his feet in the area where he thought his phone had dropped. I watched from the kayak, getting more impatient by the minute. The water was so cold that I knew Angel couldn't stay in there for much longer, and I was hoping he'd either find the phone quickly or give up and get back on the kayak. But then, out of nowhere, Angel yelled out and his whole body flipped forward. 1 second he was standing upright in the water, and the next second he was completely submerged. At first I thought maybe he'd slipped on the muddy bottom, or maybe he'd actually found his phone and dove down to grab it. But after a few seconds passed without Angel resurfacing, I realized something was seriously wrong. I didn't even think. I just started yanking off my shoes and jacket, preparing to jump in after him. Before I could get in the water though, Angel burst up from the marsh, covered head to toe in filthy muck and mud, and he was screaming at me to get out of there as fast as possible. I helped pull him back into the kayak, and we started paddling away from that spot as quickly as we could. Angel was shaking, and not just from the cold water by the looks of it. He kept looking back over his shoulder at the water like he expected something to follow us. Once we were a decent distance away, I asked him what had happened down there. Angel said that while he was feeling around for the phone with his feet, something had grabbed his ankle and yanked him under. He had a hard time describing what it felt like. He said it wasn't exactly a hand, but it wasn't a tentacle or a set of teeth either, just something that wrapped around his ankle with incredible strength. According to Angel, after he went under, whatever had grabbed him tried to drag him away from where we had been fishing. He said he fought against it with everything he had, kicking and struggling, until he finally managed to break free from its grip. We called it a day and headed back to the boat launch, despite Angel not having found his phone. But that clearly wasn't what was on his mind. The whole ride back, he barely said a word. I kept trying to convince him that maybe it had been a big catfish or an alligator gar that had grabbed him. But at the end of the day, I hadn't been the one to feel it, so I couldn't exactly convince him of anything. Angel insisted that what grabbed him didn't feel like any fish or animal he'd ever encountered. He was so unsettled and manic that I honestly started to feel spooked myself. I mean, what could that thing have been? My mind started wandering, and it didn't lead me anywhere good. I've been fishing those marshes for years, and I've never experienced anything like what Angel described. Even after doing a bunch of research online, I was never able to find anything conclusive. Part of me wants to go back to that spot and see if we could figure out what's down there, but I'm not eager to do that anytime soon. I will say that every time I've been marsh fishing since then, I felt this sense of unease that should never accompany something as enjoyable as fishing. This story happened about 2 months ago, and it's something I still think about from time to time. It was me, Kat, Nick, and Megan, the usual crew for weekend adventures. We'd been looking for something to do on a Saturday evening, and Nick brought up this reservoir near Megan's house that we'd been to several times before. It's kind of a classic spot amongst our friend group. Nick and I knew it was stocked with bass, so we were eager to get some fishing in since the two of us are pretty obsessed with the activity. Kat and Megan were just excited to drink a little at the water's edge and maybe go for a dip if they were feeling adventurous enough. Megan's house is way out in the sticks, and the reservoir is maybe a 10-minute drive away, followed by a short walk through some woods behind her neighborhood. It's technically county property, which is obvious from the many no trespassing signs posted every few yards along the chain link fence that surrounds it, but Megan had cut a hole in the fence ages ago. We laughed about it every time we went there, joking about how we'd found this perfect hidden spot that nobody else knew about. The reservoir itself is pretty small. It's surrounded by thick woods on 3 sides and a small access road on the 4th. The water's crystal clear, and there's this little sandy area where we usually set up. We call it the beach because of the sand and the fact that there are some flat rocks perfect for lounging on. It really is a nice spot, and since it's so secluded, we can blast music and be rowdy without worrying about disturbing anyone. The sun was already going down by the time we made it through the fence. Nick and I immediately started setting up our fishing gear, even though we both knew we probably wouldn't be doing much fishing. The girls spread out a blanket and got right to the drinking. It was a vibe, especially since I had a little thing for Megan, and Nick for Kat. As the girls were debating going for a little dip, Kat pointed something out that none of us had noticed before. She was squinting down the bank, asking if we saw that canoe over there. We all looked in the direction she was pointing. Sure enough, a little ways down the shoreline was a canoe wedged into some reeds near the edge of the water. It was positioned oddly, like it had just drifted there without being tied off properly. The weird thing was, we'd been to the reservoir dozens of times over the past year alone, and none of us had ever seen a canoe there before. Nick and I are both pretty curious by nature, and the canoe was close enough that we figured we might as well go check it out. The girls seemed more interested in their music and drinks, so they waved us off when we said we're gonna investigate. The walk along the bank took maybe 3 minutes. As we approached the canoe, I realized something was wrong. It wasn't just an empty canoe. It looked like someone had been using it recently and then just left. Like there was a fishing rod with its line still dangling into the water, alongside a tackle box lying open like someone had been digging through it. That wasn't the only thing. There was a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in plastic sitting on the seat. But the strangest thing by far was the phone. It was sitting right there on the main seat, locked but with the flashlight on. I pointed it out to Nick, asking who just leaves their phone behind like that. Nick shrugged, but I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. All the other stuff, the fishing gear, even the sandwich, could be explained easily. Maybe someone had heard us coming, knew they were trespassing, and took off before they could get caught. but leaving behind a perfectly good cell phone, that's not something any rational person does, no matter how scared they are. I looked at Nick and then back at the canoe, taking everything in at once. I know it doesn't sound super creepy, but in the moment, it was one of the creepiest things I'd ever seen. If you were there, you would have felt the same. There was still enough light out that we should have been able to see whoever the canoe belonged to if they were anywhere nearby. We looked around the immediate area, but there was no one there. Nick said it was weird, and I agreed completely. The two of us headed back to the girls and told them what we found. The more I described the contents of the canoe, the more unsettled I felt. I remember looking back over at it, feeling this rising feeling of foreboding as I watched it gently drift back and forth in the water. The four of us talked it over for a few minutes, throwing around theories, but none of our explanations really made sense when you factored in the phone. Kat said she wanted to get out of there, and honestly, I agreed. The whole situation was giving me a bad feeling. We started packing up our stuff when Megan gasped and pointed across the reservoir. I followed her gaze and literally had to do a double take. On the far side of the water was a person standing knee-deep in the reservoir. Even though the sun had just set, I could see them clearly. They had something long in their hands that looked like it could have been a fishing rod or maybe a stick. But what really freaked me out was the fact that they were just standing there perfectly still, facing in our direction. It dawned on me that they were watching us, and they probably had been for a while. All of a sudden, the creepiness of having seen that abandoned canoe turned into straight-up fear. None of us said it out loud, but I could tell we were all thinking the same thing. We needed to get out of there immediately. We grabbed our stuff and started heading back toward the fence. We weren't quite running, but we were moving fast. And then came the thing I had been dreading. That guy started yelling after us, screaming that we shouldn't be there and to get out. That's exactly what we were doing, but he didn't seem to care. He was belligerent, and the way he kept screaming and cursing made him sound like a lunatic. I didn't think it could get much worse than that, but I turned around just in time to see him drop whatever he had been holding and start moving into deeper water. It took me 2 seconds to realize what was happening. He was swimming across the reservoir. I screamed at my friends to run, and we took off. We sprinted back to the hole in the fence and squeezed through as fast as we could. I was in the back, and as I was crawling through, I could hear splashing from the direction of the water. I made it through, and the four of us booked it in the car and sped out of there as quickly as we could. For the next 20 minutes, we sat in Megan's driveway trying to make sense of what had happened. Kat was really shaken up, and Nick was trying to calm her down, but it didn't look like it was working. She was practically in tears, and I couldn't blame her. I was still pretty freaked out myself. None of us knew what to think. I wondered if that person screaming at us had been the owner of the canoe, and if so, why was their canoe all the way across the reservoir? And why were they in the reservoir in the first place? Or, and this is the one that really got to me, had that person done something to whoever the canoe belonged to? But as Megan pointed out, that didn't make much sense considering the fact that they chased us, drawing unnecessary attention to themselves. Kat wanted to call the police, but what would we tell them? That we were trespassing and found an abandoned canoe? That someone yelled at us to get out of a place we weren't supposed to be in the first place? Not an option. It's been a few months since the incident, and we haven't been back to the reservoir since then. Part of me wants to go back there for answers, but I haven't been able to convince the girls, or even Nick, to come with me. It's probably for the best. I don't think I'm gonna forget about how creepy the whole thing was anytime soon, though. There was this one weekend that my aunt, uncle, and cousins went away upstate, and instead of taking their dog with them or to a kennel, they asked me to watch her for the weekend at their house. I was excited to do so because not only would they pay me, but they are loaded and their house is full of fun stuff to do. They have a Havanese, which is a tiny dog. Her name is Luna. I didn't mind watching Luna because she was such a calm, low-maintenance dog. I just fed her twice a day and let her out back a couple times a day. She always followed me whatever room I was in, so if I was in the giant living room watching TV, she'd be laying on the floor in the center of the room. If I went downstairs to the basement to play video games, she followed and would lay down there. While playing video games in the basement, Luna suddenly lifted her head from the ground and stared in the direction of the boiler room. I had a dog before, and I knew this was something dogs did to any slight sound, but it was still enough of a reason for me to pause the game and feel a little unsettled. I looked in the direction of the boiler room as well. It was silent and dark in there, and there was no chance of me going in there. So I unpaused the game and continued playing, albeit a bit uncomfortable now. I guess my childish fears were getting the better of me. She put her head back down for a minute, but then, again, lifted it up and looked towards the boiler room. Deep down I knew it was probably nothing, but I was still a bit too freaked out to continue playing video games comfortably. So I turned everything off and ran up the stairs, shutting the door once Luna came hopping up. They also had another big gaming room on the main floor. It was kind of disconnected from the rest of the house in that you had to go through a narrow hallway to get there. Luna plopped herself down in front of my feet in this little game room. I played more video games for a while until it got late. Then I went down the hall to the room I'd be sleeping in, a guest bedroom that was nicer than my bedroom back at home. I threw on a pair of sweatpants and a white undershirt as pajamas and jumped under the covers, not going to sleep without watching a little TV first. Luna was obviously by the bedside. She was really growing on me, how affectionate yet calm she was. I eventually turned off the TV and went to sleep. My sleep was disturbed by a growling sound. I turned on the bedside lamp and saw Luna laying still on the floor, head down, yet growling at something. I said her name a few times, but she didn't look at me. Then she lifted her head finally to look at the closet door. Her growling grew more intense, and she stood up now, still looking at the closet. She didn't bark though. In fact, I never heard her bark once. I looked at the closet, a sliding wooden door closet. It was open about 3 inches from the left side. Of course, I couldn't really see anything from the inside. I got up from the bed really sneaky-like and tiptoed closer to the closet. I don't know what I was planning on doing really. I guess I just wanted to look through the crack, or see if I could hear something. When I got about 5 feet away from the closet door, something that I couldn't see from my bed came into view through the crack of the door. And I couldn't see any face or anything, it was too dark. But I knew what I was looking at in that closet was a person's eye, perfectly tucked between the wall and the edge of the door, looking into the room, or now at me. I screamed, but it didn't do much good since I was alone. I took Luna and ran for the front door, grabbing the emergency cell phone on the counter to call 911 during my run away from the house. It was 1 in the morning, so I didn't bother calling my aunt and uncle. The cops did a thorough sweep and found someone in the pantry closet downstairs. I never saw him though, because another officer was preoccupying me with conversation to calm me down. I was just relieved to go back inside, knowing I was the only one in the house, besides Luna of course, who just might have saved my life that night. A cold December in Vermont countryside. Home alone for the night, watching my friend's dog Chester, doing him a favor. Even though it was unbearably cold outside, I couldn't let his dog out in the yard. We don't have fences up here, so he could easily run into the woods and get lost. That meant, unfortunately, I had to take him for a walk in the cold. My friend gave me an old, dirty, blue tearing leash to use. Chester seemed excited when I hooked up the leash ring onto his collar ring, and he instantly pulled me towards the front door. I could already tell he'd be a pain in the ass to walk. Stepping out into the cold was a major shock to my body. I just wanted to get through this walk as soon as possible. I ran a little bit with Chester just to warm myself up. He stopped us to sniff one of the countless trees on the side of the dirt road. I thought for sure he'd do his business, but then he perked up and stared off into the woods. Then his deep, loud bark started echoing through the woods as he tugged and tried to pull me into the woods. I tried my hardest to hold him back, but the leash snapped at a weak point, and off Chester went into the woods, disappearing in seconds. His barking faded away into the woods until I couldn't hear it anymore. I chased after him, screaming his name. He probably ran off chasing a deer or a small animal or something, but with only the light of my phone, I knew I wouldn't be able to find him. He would have to come back to me on his own. After a while, I stood in place and continuously called Chester's name. I heard footsteps nearby and got excited that Chester must have been coming back. But as the footsteps got louder, I realized they were much too loud, slow, and heavy to be a dog's footprints. They sounded more like a pair of feet making the noise, not 4 legs. I turned out my light, now convinced I was hearing the footsteps of a person. The footsteps seemed to be circling me. My fear was if it was intentional or not, and if I'd been seen or not. I tried my best to tiptoe back to the road. I was covering decent distance, and then the sound of the footsteps just stopped, or faded away. I don't remember noticing which one. But because of this, I was more laxed with my footsteps and walked a little faster. Little did I realize that the black object I was walking towards was a person's back. I stopped, as it felt like my heart did too. I was covering my mouth, trying not to make a sound, but it was obviously too late. The person definitely heard my footsteps. At this point, I took a chance and asked if they had by some chance seen my dog. But they didn't even turn around. They had their hood on, so I couldn't even gauge what they looked like. I took another chance and put my hand on their shoulder, and once again, felt like my heart stopped. The shoulder felt hard and wooden. I walked in front of the body facing the tree and saw nothing inside of the hood. Nothing but a long stick holding it up. It was some kind of fake dummy. That meant whatever was making those footsteps was still nearby. I didn't care about the noise anymore. I just ran back to the road and then up the hill and back to the house. I never went back for Chester, and he never came back to the house. Telling my friend was the worst part. He hated me afterwards, and I expected he would, given that we weren't exactly the closest friends to begin with already. That night, though, I had a nightmare. That I was in my room, and I heard Chester's barks out in the woods, like scared, whimpering type barks. I woke up and looked out the window to the dark woods, hoping the barks were real and I just heard them in my dream. But they weren't. It was silent. I don't know what happened to Chester. I don't know what the dummy was doing in the woods, and I don't know who was making those footsteps that night. Quite frankly, I'm not sure I want to know the answer to any of it. I was watching my neighbor's dog for a little extra money one night. She was a creepy neighbor though, not intentionally, but she was kind of old and had an antisocial vibe to her. She was obsessed with her dog, so when she was apparently visiting family or something across the state and couldn't bring the dog, she practically begged me to watch her. But when I agreed for the right price, she literally scolded me about what to do and not to do as far as taking care of her. The dog's name was Hazel. There was a lot of pressure put on me for watching this dog. She insisted I stay at her place instead of taking the dog next door to our place. She had a spare bedroom with a single twin-sized bed and a desk in the corner. That was all that was in the room. The dog was small, white, and puffy. I don't exactly know what kind, maybe a Bichon Frise. It was loud, yappy, and annoying though, and I hated it. I started watching it around 5, and just played on my phone for hours, only feeding the dog once that night. Thankfully, I'd only be doing this for one night. I brought over my Xbox to play games on her TV, but then I realized the TV was so archaic it didn't even have an HDMI port, so I couldn't even hook it up. So I spent most of the day playing games on my phone and listening to Hazel's yapping at every little thing. I did do a little snooping around, of course. I looked into the woman's bedroom since the door was left open, even though she told me not to go in there. The furniture was all archaic in there as well, and there was a big rectangular rug in the middle of the room, with Indian-looking patterns. When night came, I went to bed as early as possible, like 9 o'clock. I'm sure Hazel was sleeping in the woman's room. I didn't really care. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of Hazel's constant barking. I screamed, "Shut up," but the barking seemed kind of muffled in sound, like it was coming from a basement or something. But I wasn't aware of a basement in the house. I walked to where I heard the barking coming from. I was confused to realize it was coming from the woman's bedroom. I walked inside and saw the rug in the middle of the room had been rolled up to the corner, exposing a door in the grounds, opened up. It was pitch black down there, but Hazel's barking was definitely coming from down there. I was scared shitless. Obviously Hazel didn't open this door, and she was barking at something down there. I didn't want to shine a light down there in fear of what I was going to see. I was about to leave the house and run home, but I couldn't just leave Hazel down there. I whispered her name, and then the barking stopped. I was hoping to see her running up the stairs from the dark abyss any moment, but she didn't. Something did come out of the darkness, though. It was a hand grabbing onto the side of the opening. The hand of a man. I was faced with a fight or flight scenario, and being the little 15-year-old I was, I chose to run for it. I woke my parents and screamed at them what just happened. My dad called the police and reported a break-in next door. The police checked the woman's bedroom as I described. The rug was apparently back in place and the door was shut. They still went to check it out, and apparently found a big crawl space type area with a bunch of weird things laying around. No sign of a person or Hazel. When the neighbor returned home the next day, my dad confronted her for me. Apparently she threw a huge tantrum and mentioned something about the demons making noises below her at night. Then she exploded into tears over her dog. Ever since that day, we haven't spoken a single word to her. We hardly ever see her anyway. She never leaves her house. I'm okay with that. It still terrifies me to think of that night, though.
Three years ago, my partner and I bought our first home. It was a modest place, and our neighbors were wonderful. Life was good. So good, in fact, that 18 months later, when those neighbors decided to sell their house, which was larger and had more luxuries like a driveway, a garage, and a bathtub, we jumped at the chance. We bought their house and put our old one right next door up for sale. After reading several motivation letters from potential buyers, we chose a Polish couple. They only spoke in English to us and not in Dutch like we did, but everything seemed normal. They asked for some tips about the house, and we had some pleasant, small-scale small talk. But looking back, that was the calm before the storm. Even before the big incidents, things felt off. We started experiencing bizarre disturbances at the strangest hours. Sometimes at midnight, we'd hear heavy banging or incredibly loud music blasting through the walls without warning. It wasn't constant, but it was enough to make us feel like we didn't truly know who was living a few feet away. The first red flag appeared when the neighbor came home with severe damage to both sides of his car. It looked like he had scraped against a guardrail at high speed on both sides. When we asked what happened, he gave a clumsy excuse. a concrete pole on one side and a trailer taking a turn too wide on the other. We chose to believe him, even though the math didn't add up. One evening around 6 p.m., the neighbor called us in a total panic. He claimed people were outside his house, turning his security cameras away. He begged us to check it out and call the police. We looked, and sure enough, 2 men were breaking in. We called the cops immediately. It took the cops 20 minutes to arrive, so the burglars were already gone. The neighbor's wife came racing into the street, parked her car, and frantically ran inside to her sweet little French bulldog, and the police, who were at the time already there. When I was walking my dog curiously, I saw the husband park his car 3 streets away and walk to the scene, as if he was hiding the vehicle from the police. But that thought didn't occur to me at the moment. Later, when we checked the doorbell footage, we saw the burglars standing there before the break-in, calmly discussing which house to target in Polish. Nothing was stolen, no one was caught. I told the police it felt like a setup, but I never heard back. A week later, I was at a housewarming party when my partner texted me, "The music next door is insanely loud again." A few minutes later, he called me, and his tone changed to pure terror. The neighbor's car had just come tearing through our front garden and slammed into the neighbor's own front door. 2 men were frantically loading the car with high-end electronics, like flat-screen TVs, professional speakers, and other expensive gear. They looked like the same men from the week before. This time, the police were a lot quicker. They arrived in exactly 7 minutes. The officers intercepted the men while they were still loading the car. When asked for ID, the men claimed they didn't have any. Then things got surreal. The man behind the wheel looked the officer in the eye and claimed to be my neighbor using my neighbor's actual name. But there was a catch. In the 9 months that they lived next to us, my neighbor had never spoken a single word of Dutch. This man, however, spoke fluent Dutch with a thick Polish accent. Realizing the game was up, the men slammed the car into gear, and a violent pursuit followed through our quiet streets until the police managed to box them in and arrest them. But my partner could still hear movement inside our neighbor's house. The police went back in and dragged out a 3rd suspect. As we were inside our own home with an officer to report the damage to our property, the doorbell rang. We turned around, and there he was, the actual neighbor. He was unrecognizable. His face was a swollen, bloody mess. One eye was swollen shut, his mouth was torn, and his arm hung at a useless angle, covered in what looked like defensive stab wounds. He looked feral, aggressive, and broken. The police officer tried to intervene, but the neighbor flat out refused to file a report or cooperate. Since the victim wouldn't speak, the officer had no choice but to send him back to his house. Later that night, the neighbor rang our bell again. He was trembling. He confessed that he cheated on his wife, and he claimed that she had sent people to take him out. He begged to sleep at our house. Terrified and wanting no part of this underworld drama, we refused. My partner offered to drive him to the hospital instead. We dropped him off at 10:30 p.m., telling him we were staying elsewhere for the night because we no longer felt safe. But we didn't stay elsewhere. We went home, locked every door, and tried to breathe. At around 1 a.m., our dog started growling. A specific low growl he only uses when someone's at the door. We checked the doorbell camera, and there he was. The neighbor was back from the hospital, standing on our porch, ringing the doorbell multiple times. We sat in the dark, watching the screen in silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a car turned onto the street. The neighbor panicked. He scrambled off the porch and hid behind our cars in the driveway, crouching in the shadows. Watching this bloodied, broken man lurking in the dark behind our own cars was one of the most unsettling things I've ever seen. The car stopped, and a woman got out. It was his wife. She walked toward her front door, paused, and glanced at our driveway. She saw him. We held our breath, waiting for a confrontation, or worse. She walked toward him, and as she stepped into the pale yellow glow of the street lamp, she began to wail. A haunting, guttural crying. He didn't say a word, and she kept asking questions, her sobbing getting louder and louder, echoing through the empty street. Eventually, they both got into the car and drove away. We didn't see them for 3 days. We didn't even know where their dog was. The wife eventually returned alone. She found the dog inside, and she told us she doesn't think she'll ever see her husband again. Whatever the real story is, drugs, debt, or a marriage turned lethal, I've realized one thing. I don't think I want to know. This all started back in 2017 when I moved into a new house in the suburbs of Montreal, Canada, with my parents and little sister. Before I get into the juicy part of the story, I need to explain a few details about my room and its placement in the house for everything to make sense from my point of view. The house we moved into is a split-level home, meaning it has staggered floor levels connected by short flights of stairs. My room was neither on the main floor nor in the basement. It sat exactly in between the two, at ground level. One wall shared space with the garage, and the opposite side had a large window that looked out into the backyard. At the time, that window had plastic vertical blinds with several missing panels, so even when they were fully closed, I could still see outside through the gaps. On the garage side of my room was my closet, which had large sliding mirror doors. This meant that when I was in bed, no matter which side I faced, I could always see my window reflected back at me. I started noticing things about a year after we moved in, when I was 15. I remember watching YouTube videos on my tablet late at night since I had trouble falling asleep. One night, I heard something outside my window. I had left it open because it was really hot and we hadn't invested in an AC unit yet, so I relied on whatever breeze I could get. After hearing what sounded like footsteps or shuffling, I quickly paused my video and put the tablet down. The noise stopped along with the video, which made me think it had just been part of what I was watching, or maybe my imagination. I resumed the video and heard it again. I looked to my left toward the window, but didn't see anything. So I eventually fell asleep. For a few nights, nothing happened. But then one night, a couple nights later, during my usual late-night YouTube and show watching routine, I heard the shuffling again. I paused what I was watching and listened, this time longer than before. I swear I could hear breathing now too. I glanced at my window, but again, there was nothing. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me and turned to face my closet instead. As I picked my tablet back up to resume the video, I saw something move at my window through one of the gaps in the blinds, reflected in the mirror. A chill ran down my spine. I got up immediately and went to wake up my parents, deciding it was better to be safe than sorry. I told them what I had seen and heard, and even though my dad clearly doubted me, he went outside to check the backyard. A few minutes later, he came back saying he had checked every corner and didn't see anything. He told me that if someone had been there, he would have heard them come in through the squeaky gate, or he at least would have heard them leave. He also checked the Ring camera, which showed no one walking around the house toward the backyard. I suggested that the person could have jumped the fence into the neighbor's yard, but he quickly shut that down, saying we lived in a safe neighborhood, and that I should stop watching scary movies. Unfortunately, I believed him and went back to bed. Every couple of weeks or months after that, I'd hear things again. Each time, I convinced myself it was all in my head and tried to focus on my videos or fall asleep. When winter came and everything was covered in snow, it stopped, and I eventually forgot about it. But the following year, it started again. It didn't happen often, once or twice a month at most, and always past 11 p.m. I tried not to pay attention to it, even when the noises sounded like clear footsteps or deep breathing. I watched a lot of scary movies and videos, so I kept telling myself that had to be the reason. I avoided looking at the window altogether, even though I tried to believe it was all in my head. Part of me was terrified of being proven wrong. One night, against my better judgment, I looked. Not directly at the window, that was too scary. I looked at the mirror instead. This time, I swear I saw the silhouette of a person. I ran upstairs again, and once again, after checking the entire backyard, my dad told me the same thing he had the year before. And once again, I believed him. This went on for a while. I started going to bed earlier, watching videos louder or with headphones, and completely avoiding my mirror, or worse, looking directly at my window. It always stopped when the weather got colder and started again in mid-spring. One night in early December of 2021, there was a huge windstorm. I was watching a stream with my boyfriend over Discord when I decided to grab a glass of water around 11:30 p.m. On my way, I noticed my parents sitting in the living room. It caught me off guard since they rarely stayed up that late, let alone outside their bedroom. Their faces looked tense and preoccupied. I asked if everything was okay, but they brushed it off, assuring me it was nothing. I assumed I had walked in on a conversation not meant for my ears and headed back toward my room. As I turned toward the stairs, flashes of red and blue light caught my attention through the front window. A police car was pulling into our driveway. My parents immediately stood up as if they'd been expecting it, and they rushed me to my room, telling me they'd call me if needed. I wanted answers, but I knew it wasn't time to push, so I went back to my room, curiosity eating away at me. Not even 2 minutes later, I was called back upstairs. This time, they didn't keep me in the dark. My dad explained that about 15 to 20 minutes earlier, during the windstorm, he had stepped into the backyard to make sure nothing had been blown over before going to bed. While scanning the yard, he noticed the light from my bedroom window illuminating something near it. As his eye adjusted, he realized it was a man standing motionless just outside my window, staring in. My dad yelled at him and started moving toward him, but the man immediately turned and ran. He jumped the back fence effortlessly, as if he'd done it 100 times before, and he disappeared into the neighboring yards. In that moment, everything I had feared for years stopped being a possibility and became a fact. I hadn't imagined it. Someone really had been there. Terrified, my parents called the police right away, and then went to knock on the neighbor's door to warn her. The older woman who lived there didn't open the door. Instead, she yelled at them to leave or she would call the cops herself. The police eventually arrived, but since my dad hadn't gotten a clear look at the man, there wasn't much they could do beyond increasing patrols in the area and recommending we install more cameras, which we did. In retrospect, my back neighbor's reaction still feels deeply suspicious to me. Why was her first response to threaten my parents when all they did was knock on her door to warn her? It raises a couple questions, such as, was she living with that man my dad saw? Or had she seen him too and genuinely thought it was him knocking? Did I know the person who stood outside my window for years, or was it just some creepy neighbor who noticed a teenage girl's room with poorly covered blinds and took advantage of it? Did he only want to watch, or was he working up to something else? Even now, those questions haunt me. Knowing that someone was really there the entire time makes every sound I brushed off, every breath I thought I imagined, and every silhouette I forced myself not to look at feel so much more terrifying. I've since switched rooms and can't look at windows facing our backyard the same way anymore. Thank God mine now faces the street. What scares me the most isn't that it happened, it's how long it went on for, without anyone knowing, and how easily it could have continued. It was a cold winter day in mid-December, and I was 15 years old. I originally lived in a suburban area of Alberta with my parents in our apartment. However, we were running low on space, and with my little sister on her way, we knew we had to move to a bigger house. It seemed lucky for us at first, because there was a house just a few blocks down that was selling for a very cheap price tag. Granted, it wasn't the best looking or in the best area, but it had room to grow in. And for the price we paid, we could renovate to our heart's content. My dad did renovate slightly with the money we had left, but mainly the basement as it was almost unusable without being fixed up. Cleaning, carpeting, new beams, fixing the bathroom, and fresh wallpaper with a cool pattern I got to choose myself. For the first couple of months, living there had been great, and I was really enjoying the new house. Until the first questionable moment came along. It was my father's birthday, and to celebrate, we all had gone to a restaurant in the evening. All went well until we came home to our front door wide open. My mom was absolutely shaken, and we begged my dad to drive us away from the house while she called the police. My dad grabbed a large, heavy wrench from his toolbox in the truck and went into the house to search for the intruder. My mom and I called the cops anyway, and we sat there for 5 excruciatingly long minutes before they arrived. They searched the house and found my dad, and he came back out and told us nothing was actually stolen, and no one was in the house either. However, some of our items were moved or knocked over, specifically the books on my bookshelf. The police eventually finished their search and told us the same thing. We were still a little paranoid, but finally, we went inside our home. From that day forward, I would always hear strange noises coming from the walls, and sometimes underneath our basement. Might I add, my room was there, in the basement, but I always dismissed the sounds as the pipes. This was an older house after all. That was until one night something unexplainable happened. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was playing with my Nintendo DS under the sheets with no volume so my parents didn't know I was still awake. That's when I heard it. Clear laughter coming from the wall to the side of my bed. My heart froze in time, and my eyes probably widened to the size of plates. I didn't know what I should do. Ignore it? Call my parents? Go investigate? I decided to wait for a while to see if it happened again. But after about 30 minutes of laying still as a stone, I decided it must have just been my sleep-deprived imagination, and finally went to sleep. I woke up the next morning in my bed. As usual, nothing changed. Despite that laugh still burning in my mind, I tried to pass it off. I would still hear the same strange noises every so often for the next couple of weeks, but that felt normal for me now. This is when the next occurrence happens. By this time, my sister was already born, and since the basement was big enough, plus my mom trusted me with keeping her safe at night, she shared the room with me. Now, this doesn't mean my mom didn't use baby monitors, because she did. She kept the parent units in the living room, and the other in the kitchen. One night, my parents had gone out for a late-night dinner and left me to take care of the house until they got back. I was in the living room watching a movie when I got up to get a snack from the kitchen. That's when I noticed odd noises coming from the baby monitor. And my heart sank. I knew no one else was home, but those were footsteps, loud, heavy footsteps. Suddenly, my fear was realized when my sister started crying, and I heard a faint shh sound come out of the speaker, followed by a crash. I instantly did the first thing that came to mind, which now, thinking clearly in retrospect, could have gotten us both killed. I ran as quickly as I could up to my parents' room and grabbed my father's rifle. However, I didn't have the key to unlock the trigger lock or any of the ammunition. I figured I would pretend it was loaded and try to hide the lock with my hand. If I was attacked, I would use the buttstock to defend myself. All I thought of was getting my sister to safety. When I got to the basement door, I opened it quietly and walked down the steps, turning to face my sister's crib. No one was there, but she was still crying, as well as the baby monitor being on the ground sideways. I mustered all the courage I could and yelled, "I'm armed. Come out before I find you." Still nothing. I grabbed my sister and ran upstairs. I closed the basement door and pushed a chair under the handle to keep it locked while I called my parents. They called the police and got home as fast as they could. The police got to my house before my parents did, so they made me sit in the back of the cop car with my baby sister while one of the police officers went inside to investigate. When my parents arrived, I told them everything that happened. They were confused but very concerned. They knew I wasn't the type of kid that would lie about something like this. The police officer came out and gave us an all clear and said no one was in the house. Just as they finished talking to us and were about to leave, my dad worriedly asked them if they checked behind the bookshelf. In my room, there was a bookshelf that came embedded into the wall, so I was very confused when my dad asked to look behind it. The police officer was confused too, and asked my father to come inside with him and point out what he meant. Lo and behold, when we got downstairs, my bookshelf was pushed open slightly like a door, and the basement window that leads to the backyard was opened all the way, with my desk chair planted under it. Behind the bookshelf was a small room with some of the pipes to our house, and the pipes wrapped around some of the walls. On the ground were some food wrappers, one of our cups that had gone missing, lotion, a switchblade, along with an apple that was partially eaten but still slightly fresh. Someone had been living in our house, and we didn't even know it this whole time. The police said that most likely while they were outside talking to us, whoever was here escaped through the open window. They said to call if we ever noticed anything suspicious. However, they didn't think the person would come back now that we knew of their secret. That wasn't even the most horrifying part, however. A few days later, I pushed open the bookshelf myself and explored it top to bottom. That's when I found a tiny hole in the wall, and when I looked through, it pointed directly to my bed and dresser. Whoever was in there was watching me sleep, get dressed, play my video games, do my homework, speak on the phone, everything. They knew most of my life. I'm an adult now, and I live in my own apartment with my boyfriend. My parents still live there 5 years later. To this day, I worry for them, and hope whoever that was never returns.
Every so often when we were little, our parents would go away for a weekend while our Uncle Ron would watch us. Our Uncle Ron has been single his whole life, but he always loved kids, so he always happily did it. One Friday night, the same night our parents left town, we were all watching Titanic during a monster snowstorm. Me, my 2 brothers, my older sister, and our Uncle Ron. I remember certain parts of this night so vividly, but other parts I just draw blanks. I do remember, however, that the power flicked off briefly, and we had to reset the VCR to get back to where we were in the movie. Shortly after that, our Uncle Ron was fast asleep. We let him sleep while we kept watching the movie. It was at the part where Rose was running with the axe back to the room that Jack was trapped in. One of my brothers was coming back from the bathroom, and on his way, he went outside for whatever reason, likely just to look at the snow. He came back inside yelling for us to come take a look at something. Starved for a little excitement, I guess, the 3 of us ran to the back door. We could see what he was talking about now. There was a set of footprints in the snow. It led from the back door, then to the window, and then back in the direction of the yard and woods. To make the matter even more eerie, he said he heard the back doorknob turn. Our sister, even though she was the oldest by 3 years, ran inside freaking out. My brothers and I, on the other hand, were kind of excited by it and wanted to follow the footprints. Our sister was threatening to wake up our Uncle Ron as she saw us putting our coats and boots on, but I convinced her it'd be fine and we weren't going too far, and that we'd be together. She went back to the living room to watch the movie without us while we all marched out into the cold snowstorm, following the footprints that were quickly filling in with new snow. The footprints led to the woods in the backyard. The deeper into the woods we got, the deeper the footprints were. We weren't sure if that was because less snow was falling to the ground under the trees, or because the footprints were fresher. We were following those footprints for a while, until finally, we saw where they were leading to. A cabin literally tucked away in the woods. It was dark inside though. No light was emitting from the windows. The footsteps led to the front door of the cabin, but we didn't dare go up to it. Instead, we crept over to the closest window to peer inside. It was too dark to see anything inside though, but we noticed it wasn't actually a glass window. It was just a screen. Then there were 2 thumps from inside of the cabin, and then the sound of something sliding. We didn't see what caused the sound though. Suddenly, one of my brothers screamed and pointed behind us. We turned to see a head poking out from another window of the cabin, but it was so dark all we could see was blackness, no features. Then the head disappeared from view as we heard rapid thumping sounds inside of the cabin, and then the front door to the cabin burst open. We all screamed and ran for our dear lives back in the direction of the house, following the footprints. I don't think we were actually chased though. The next day we tried taking our Uncle Ron on a hike to that cabin, but we couldn't for the lives of us find it. The creepiest thing to this day we still live in the same house, and after all these years, we still never came across that cabin again. In fact, we can't even find it on maps or Google Earth. If it weren't for the fact that I was with my two brothers, I would question if this ever even happened. My friends, who I'll refer to as S and J, came along with me on a little camping trip near Blue Mountain National Park. We set up camp near a small pond just because it seemed like the coolest place to chill. The point of this whole trip was mainly just to get out, drink a bunch of beers with friends, and chill. I cracked open my second Budweiser, laughing it up with S and J, talking about some of our other friends with music playing in the background, overall just having a good time. Then, however, I saw S reach over for the speaker and turn it down all the way, and then shushed us and pointed out to the pond. S whispered, "Do you guys see that?" Jay and I looked out to the pond. The campfire had a glow that partially reflected on the pond water, but even yet, I couldn't see what he was pointing at. S whispered, "There's something in the water." I went into the tent to get the flashlight from my bag. When I came out, S said don't, but I turned it on anyway and aimed it at the pond. The light didn't reveal anything or anyone, but we did all hear the sound of water being pushed, as if someone or something were walking in it. I turned out the light just because I was freaked out and looked at my two friends, who were both wearing cringing faces. I told S to shut off the speakers completely now. We all sat in our chairs, not really saying much anymore, just listening to the surroundings. About an hour passed, and within that time, nothing happened. So we grew more comfortable again, and things went back to normal. Eventually, I went to my tent, and S and J went to the tent that they'd be sharing, and we all went to sleep. Now that I was alone with my thoughts, however, I started thinking of that thing that S said was in the water. He never actually described what it looked like, if it was an animal or a person. My sense of hearing was heightened as I was in a state of alert, and because of that, I heard something from the woods. I sat up, since that always seems to help with concentration. I needed to hear one more sound before I could confirm something wasn't right. There was the sound again, much closer now, and I was able to confirm it was a foot hitting the ground. Whether it was a person's foot or an animal's foot was still unclear, however. I heard another footstep, this time much closer. It was clear someone or something was sneaking around our campsite. There was one final footstep. It was really close to the tent. I started texting S, but I was only able to type out the words, "There's something," before the gut-wrenching, blood-curdling scream pierced through the walls of the tent. I couldn't tell if it was the scream of a man or a woman. It's hard to explain, but it was deep enough where it could be a man, but not so deep to the point that it couldn't be a woman. The scream lasted about 5 seconds. Then there was silence. I didn't know if I should get out, call for my friends, or stay silent. I texted S, "Dude, we have to run." He responded, "What was that?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I tried to think of what we could do. But pretty soon, S texted me again, saying the coast is clear, run for the car. I grabbed the keys from my bag, opened the zipper to the tent, and sprinted to the car, which luckily was only about 30 seconds away. We stayed in the car all night and went back the next morning for our stuff, which luckily was all still there. Still have no idea who, or even dare I say what that thing was at our campsite that night. Just happy we got out okay. Skipping most of the background of the story, I once found myself walking through the woods during a slight drizzle. All I had on me was my backpack with a spare pair of pants, a flashlight, a tripod and camera, and some granola bars. I'm a photographer and video editor, and I was recording footage of a forest during rain, a river during rain, and snagging some pictures as well. Long story short, I found myself lost, trying to find my car. It was the worst day of my life. I was panicking, stressed, screaming to myself in anger, just wanting to find the car. I'd say an hour after getting lost, I started to pick up on noises around me. I don't mean multiple noises at once. I mean at times I'd hear the same noise, just on different sides of me. The noise was footsteps, undeniably. I was starting to panic that I was being hunted by a bear. That was only at first, though. I slowed down to quiet my own footsteps so I would more likely hear where the other footsteps were, and when I did, I turned my head as quickly as possible in that direction. I saw half a person's body jumping behind a tree. Instead of calling out something or confronting them, I did what I still think was the smart thing. I walked away fast, playing it off like I didn't see him. It was starting to get darker every minute now, and the rain was still coming down lightly, but my heart was racing faster than ever. I checked my phone every 10 seconds and finally got one bar. I stopped walking, wiped the screen of rainwater, and opened maps first thing to find the nearest road, which was very close. I let out a sigh of relief, only to hear footsteps closing in on me from behind. I turned and spotted the person again. It was a man, and I know that in of itself doesn't sound so disturbing, just really sketchy, but I'm telling you, the sight was horrifying. I could only see the man briefly before he jumped behind a tree once again as if he thought I couldn't see him. But he looked huge. Really tall, average build, maybe a little overweight, jeans, and from what I could tell, a dark blue jacket with the hood up, half zipped down, exposing a white shirt underneath. He also had on glasses, but that's all I got of his face. He was hiding behind a tree maybe 15 feet away, and over the sound of millions of raindrops, all I heard was psst, psst. Now I ran. I didn't care anymore. I was borderline about to have a panic attack. I continued running when I found the road. I ran until I thought there was no chance of him catching up to me. Then I continued walking until I finally hitched a ride from a passing car, who took me back to where I was parked. I didn't bother mentioning what happened to the driver. I just told him I got lost is all. He went on his way as I got into my car and drove the half-hour trip back home, all the while reflecting on what just happened and my life. It was 2022. I was living in the Bay Area at the time, Oakland specifically, and I'd driven up to visit my parents in Eureka for the weekend. If you've never driven Highway 101 along the Northern California coast, it's beautiful during the day and kind of a nightmare at night. Like long stretches with no other cars, no cell service, barely any lights, kind of ominous really. I left my parents' place around 8 p.m. on a Sunday, which was stupid in hindsight. I should have just stayed the night and driven back Monday morning, but I had an early shift and figured I'd rather just knock out the drive. Famous last words, I guess. The first couple hours were fine. The stretch I was on had narrowed down to a 2-lane road at that point. That's how most of rural 101 is once you get north of the bay. It was somewhere around Trinidad when the fog started rolling in. Fog on that part of the coast isn't unusual, but this was different. Within maybe 5 minutes, it went from clear visibility to barely being able to see 20 feet ahead of my car. It was actually really bad, worse than I'm describing. I slowed down to maybe 35 and kept going. The smart thing would have been to pull off and wait it out, but there's really not a lot of places to stop on that stretch. And honestly, I just wanted to get home. I figured if I took it slow, I'd be fine. Here's the thing about fog that thick though, and any California driver knows this, but it messes with your sense of space. You can't see landmarks, you can't tell how far you've gone, you can't see what's coming up ahead. It's disorienting as hell, especially when you're already tired. After another half hour or so of driving, I saw a figure standing off the side of the road. I say figure because that's genuinely what it looked like at first.
just a shape on the shoulder, maybe 50 feet ahead. As I got closer, I could see it was a person, a guy based on how tall it was, and he was just standing there facing the road. He wasn't walking or waving me down like he needed a lift, and it didn't look like he was on the phone either. He was genuinely just standing there. I slowed down even more as I passed because I was worried about clipping him if he stepped out into the road. He didn't move though. He didn't even turn his head to watch my car go by, which was really creepy. I got a good look at him as I passed, and there was nothing about his face that struck me as particularly unusual. My first thought was maybe his car broke down somewhere and he was waiting for a ride, which would make sense, right? Except I hadn't passed any cars on the shoulder, and there was no reason for him to be standing in that exact spot facing that exact direction. There was nothing there. I thought about turning around to ask if he needed help, but something about the whole thing felt wrong. It wasn't my problem, so I just kept driving. About 10 minutes later, though, I saw him again. I'm not exaggerating, it was the same guy. Same build, same dark clothes, same stance on the shoulder. The only difference was that this time he was on the left side instead of the right, but everything else was identical. I actually said "what the hell" audibly out loud to myself, because there was no way this guy could have gotten ahead of me. I was the only car on the road, and there weren't any cross streets or shortcuts or anything like that. The only explanation was that it was a different person who just happened to look exactly like the first guy and was standing in exactly the same weird way. I didn't want to look at him as I passed, but I couldn't help myself. I had to confirm whether it was the same guy, and after getting a good look, I was dead certain it was. But this time, the guy actually locked eyes with me as I passed, and I couldn't look away fast enough. Seeing his head snap to my eyes was really freaky, and I instantly regretted making eye contact. I sped up a little, not a lot, because the fog was still thick and I wasn't trying to drive off the road, but I sped up enough that I was pushing 45. I wanted distance between me and whatever the hell was going on back there. The fog got even worse after that though. I could barely see the center line at that point, so I really had no choice but to slow back down. I was having trouble thinking straight, which I attributed to the mixed effect of how tired I was, how hard it was to drive, and what I had just seen. I kept trying to rationalize it, but I couldn't. My train of thought was interrupted though, because not 3 minutes later, my headlights exposed something ahead. There was another person up there, only this time he was standing in the middle of the road. I had no choice but to stop, which is exactly what I did. This time he was wearing a hood that was covering his face, so I couldn't see what exactly he looked like, but I had a feeling it was the same guy. He once again didn't move, which is when I started really getting scared. We were at a standstill, and even though I couldn't see his face, I could feel him looking at me. I didn't know what to do. I flashed my brights at him a few times, trying to get him to move out of the way or at the very least react, but he didn't. I put the car in reverse, and when I looked in my rearview mirror, I nearly died. There was someone behind me. There was a person back there, creeping towards my car. I yelled "holy shit" and put the car back in drive. I was boxed in, but I didn't care. There was an actual threat on my life now. I pulled hard to the right, crossing into the opposite lane to get around the guy blocking the road ahead. The guy didn't move, and I thought I was in the clear, but then something hit my car from behind. It wasn't just a light tap, it was violent. The whole back end of my car jolted to the right, and I heard this awful crunching sound, like metal on metal. I maintained control of the car and kept driving, thinking I had gotten into an accident with another car, but when I checked my mirrors, there was nothing behind me. Nothing at all, not even those people. As if the situation wasn't already freaky enough, that made it so much worse. I wasn't waiting though. I sped off as fast as I was comfortable going with how heavy the fog was. By the time I hit the 101 interchange, I could actually see again, and for the first time, I felt my brain starting to relax. But the more I calmed down, the more I thought about what had happened. And this might sound surprising, but I genuinely concluded that I hallucinated everything. Here's the thing, I had been driving for almost 4 hours at that point. I was exhausted. I had been staring into fog for God knows how long, barely able to see anything, completely alone on a dark highway. So an extremely vivid hallucination didn't seem that far-fetched to me. Why it was so oddly specific was beyond me, but there was no other explanation for me having seen those people or having felt a wreck that didn't actually happen. By the time I made it home, I was just ready to sleep the whole thing off and try to forget about it. but then I walked around to the back of my car. The rear bumper was destroyed. There was a massive dent running almost the entire width of it, which meant whatever hit me had hit me way harder than I thought. It also meant that I actually had been hit, meaning I hadn't hallucinated anything. I stared at the dent for like 5 minutes. There wasn't any paint transfer, which there definitely would have been if I had been hit by another car. But if it wasn't another car that had hit me, I had no idea what could have caused such considerable damage. I did end up calling the cops to report what I saw, but it was more so just to get the info out there. I've thought about that night a lot over the past 4 years. I've gone through every possible explanation I could think of. What I've accepted is that I hallucinated the figures, and in my panicked attempt to drive off, I hit a guardrail post or a mile marker or something like that. The thing that gets me is this though. I can accept a hallucination, but for me to hallucinate one thing, the figures, while actually experiencing the other, the crash, is something I have trouble accepting. The fact that there was actually damage to my car has always made me think there was something more malicious going on that night. This happened this past spring break, so we're talking only a few weeks ago. I'm still in college, I'm a senior now, and I went back to my hometown for the week like I always do. The problem with going home, though, is that there's genuinely nothing to do there. I grew up in one of those suburban towns that's technically close to a city, but doesn't have any of the benefits of actually being in one, meaning no bars or nightlife or anything really within walking distance. When I'm at school, I've always got something going on, but back at home, it's a ghost town. The other issue is that none of my hometown friends had the same spring break schedule as me. I've got maybe 4 or 5 people I still keep in touch with from high school, and every single one of them was either still in class or already had their spring break earlier in March, so I was looking at a full week of doing nothing, which I really wasn't thrilled about. I should probably also mention that I've been trying to cut back on some stuff lately, nicotine and alcohol mainly. I figured a week at home with nothing to do was either going to make that worse or give me a chance to reset. I decided I was going to work out every single day instead. I was going to lift in the mornings and run in the afternoons, keep myself busy just so I could stay out of my own head. That's how I ended up going for a run on a random Tuesday afternoon. I remembered this loop I used to do back when I ran cross country in high school. It's exactly 3 miles from start to finish, starting and ending at my house. The route takes me through my neighborhood for maybe a quarter mile, then cuts into this wooded trail that winds through a small patch of forest before spitting you back out onto the street about a block from home. I've probably run that loop 1,000 times between freshman and senior year. The woods is the best part, honestly. Running on pavement destroys your knees, but the trail through the woods is soft. It's quiet in there too, which is something I always look for on my runs. So I headed out around 5. The sun wasn't going to set for another couple hours, so I wasn't worried about visibility. What I did notice though, and I noticed it the second I stepped outside, was the fog. I don't know how to describe it other than to say it was thick in a way I'd never seen before. I've lived in that town my whole life, and I don't remember fog like that. It looked fake almost, like I was in some ambient video game or one of those lo-fi YouTube videos with the anime girl studying. Everything past maybe 30 or 40 feet just dissolved into haze. I thought about skipping the run, but I talked myself out of it. The trail through the woods is a straight shot, one path with no forks or diverging paths. I've been through there so many times I could probably do it blindfolded. Getting lost wasn't even a possibility. I had my Garmin watch on so I could track my pace and distance. I started my workout, did the quarter mile through the neighborhood, and entered the woods. The fog was even thicker in there, which made sense since the trees blocked out a lot of the remaining daylight. I couldn't see more than 15 or 20 feet ahead of me, but the trail is easy to follow. For the first mile and a half, everything was normal. I was running a little slower than usual because of the visibility, but it wasn't too bad. I remember checking my watch around the mile mark, then again at a mile and a half. The issue started around the 2.5 mile mark. At that point in the loop, I should have been approaching the end of the trail. The path curves to the left, you go up a small hill, and then you're out, back on pavement. I know that section by heart. Hell, I know every section by heart. I've literally run that loop hundreds of times. But when I looked down at my watch and saw 2.5 miles,
I was still deep in the woods. I figured my watch was just being weird. It was at least 4 years old at that point, so I assumed its GPS signal was getting interrupted by the dense tree coverage or something. The fog could have been messing with it too. These seemed like reasonable enough explanations though, so I just kept running, assuming I wasn't as far along the trail as I thought. But then I passed 3 miles, which was when I knew something was up. 3 miles is the entire loop. At 3 miles, I should have been standing either in my driveway or on the street. Instead, I was still surrounded by trees on both sides, still running on the same dirt path with no indication that I was anywhere close to getting out. So I stopped. I'm not a paranoid person, and I'm not superstitious either. There must have been some rational explanation for what was going on. I caught my breath and tried to think, but I genuinely could not figure out what was going on. There was only one trail, which I knew for a fact. There weren't any forks, branches, or alternate paths. The only way I could have gotten lost in there was if I had physically left the path and waded through the brush and undergrowth, which I definitely hadn't done. I checked my watch again. 3.1 miles. The number kept ticking up even though I was standing still, which told me the GPS was definitely having issues. That was the only part of the whole thing that made any sense. I didn't really have a choice at that point. I could either keep running forward and hope I eventually hit the exit, or I could turn around and retrace my steps. The second option seemed smarter. If I just ran back the way I came, I'd eventually get to the trailhead where I started, and from there, I knew exactly how to get home. So that's what I did. I turned around and started running back. The fog had gotten worse. I didn't know how that was even possible, but it had. I had to slow my pace just to make sure I didn't run off the trail by accident. After about a mile of running, so about 4 total miles at that point, I heard something. Like I said earlier, it's usually dead quiet in the woods, which I suspect is the case because it's too small for a lot of animals to inhabit. So hearing a sound out there was something my brain wasn't prepared for, but the sound itself was so much worse. It was something I'd never heard before. The closest I can get to describing it is a moan, but that's not quite right. It was lower than a moan, more like a drone, and it fluctuated. It would swell up, then dip back down, then swell up again. Almost like a siren, but human. I can't overstate how wrong it sounded. It wasn't someone calling for help, and it didn't really sound like someone in pain either. It was just a sustained, wavering noise that didn't seem to have any purpose. I started running faster, but you have to remember that I had been running for over 4 miles at that point. I could only go so fast, and the exhaustion only made the situation that much more terrifying. Running faster only tired me out more, and the more tired I got, the more scared I got. The sound didn't stop no matter how fast I ran. Whoever or whatever was out there was matching my speed. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, and I did multiple times, I couldn't see anything. There was just fog back there. I ran with the sound following me for what felt like forever. I had no other choice. It was the scariest moment of my life. After an eternity of running, I finally made it out of the woods. I ran into the street and nearly threw up out of exhaustion. The fog was still impossibly thick, even outside the woods. I turned around and looked back into the woods. To my horror, there was something standing right in the middle of the trail. Just a little ways beyond the trailhead. I say something because I don't know what else to call it. It was just a shape, this dark mass of a silhouette. It was way taller than me, and I'm 6'1". This thing had to be 7 feet tall at least. It wasn't moving closer or further away from me. It just watched me. I could feel it. If it weren't for the fact that it was gently swaying back and forth, I would have questioned whether I was looking at a tree or something. The droning sound had stopped, but I wasn't giving it another thought. I turned and ran home without looking back. That was a few weeks ago now. I'm back at school at this point, but I haven't been able to think about that night. I can't get that image of what I saw in the fog out of my head. That black mass and that god-awful sound. I told my parents about what I saw, obviously, and they both seemed convinced that it was just a tall person trying to scare me, or potentially attack me, which I guess is possible, but I don't believe that. How were they able to make that noise while running to keep up with me? Impossible. And how tall they were, too. I don't know what was in those woods that night, and I probably never will.
This happened about 6 years ago, late September. My buddy Edwin and I had been talking about kayaking Willapa Bay for probably 2 years at that point, and we finally locked in a weekend to actually do it. If you're not familiar with the area, Willapa Bay is this massive tidal estuary on the Washington coast, something like 25 miles long. It's mostly oyster farms and wildlife refuge, and on a clear day, it's honestly one of the most peaceful places I've ever been. The weekend we picked was not a clear day. Neither of us were amateurs. We'd both been kayaking since we were kids, and Edwin actually worked as a guide for a few summers during college. We knew what we were doing. That's important context for what I'm about to tell you, because I don't want anyone thinking we were just a couple of idiots who got spooked because we didn't know how hot water and fog work. We launched early Saturday morning from a put-in spot near Nakota. The fog was really thick, but we figured it would burn off by mid-morning like it usually does on the coast. We had a GPS, a compass, and everything. The plan was to paddle out toward Long Island, maybe do some bird watching, have lunch on one of the sandbars, and head back before the afternoon tide shift. The first hour or so was fine. The fog muffled everything in that way coastal fog does. You feel like you're paddling through cotton and everything is really quiet. We couldn't see more than maybe 40 feet in any direction, but we were staying close together and checking our bearing every few minutes. No big deal. It was probably around 9 a.m. when I first heard something. It was a splashing sound. At first, I thought it was Edwin. We were paddling in loose tandem formation, him about 15 feet to my left, and I figured he just adjusted his stroke or something. But when I glanced over, his paddle was resting across his kayak. He asked if I heard that too, and I nodded my head yes. We both stopped paddling and just drifted there for a second, listening. It was the sound of oars, not paddles, which I say specifically because oars and paddles make distinct sounds. We were using paddles. You'd only use oars if you were on a different kind of boat, but it was definitely someone rowing a boat, and it didn't sound too far away from us either. Maybe 100 feet somewhere off to the right. Edwin said it was probably just someone else out there on the water, which seemed reasonable enough. There were other kayakers who used the bay, and occasionally you'd see fishermen in small boats checking crab pots. The fog was thick enough that we couldn't see them, but sound travels strangely over water, especially in fog. Sometimes things sound closer than they are, sometimes they sound further. We waited for a minute, expecting whoever it was to either call out or appear through the haze. Standard etiquette when visibility is low is to announce yourself and let other boaters know where you are, but the rowing just continued at the same steady pace. I suggested maybe they didn't know we were there, so Edwin said hello into the nothingness. But there was no response. In fact, whoever was in the other boat didn't even seem to notice, because the rowing sounds didn't speed up, slow down, or change at all. We started paddling again, figuring we'd either come across them or they'd pass by. But here's the thing, and I know this sounds paranoid, but over the next 20 minutes, that rowing sound never got any closer or further away. Hearing that same exact rhythm over and over again started getting intoxicating, and after a while, I was actually in awe of how perfectly someone could keep their stride for so long. But as time went past, I only got more and more freaked out. It was an unsettling situation, to say the least. Edwin and I really weren't talking much anymore, but I knew he felt the same way. At one point, we shifted our course slightly east, trying to angle toward the shore, and for a split second, the fog thinned out just enough for me to see a small rowboat sitting in the water. I could see the shape of someone at the oars, so I knew there was a person in it. But then the fog closed back in, and they were out of sight again. The whole glimpse lasted maybe 3 seconds. I asked Edwin if he'd seen it, and he said yes. At that point, I wanted to leave. Something about the whole situation was making me deeply uncomfortable, and I couldn't even fully articulate why. It's not like we'd seen anything threatening. It was just some guy rowing a boat, but the way he refused to identify himself or even acknowledge our presence, and the way he seemed to be following us, was just so creepy. I started heading for the shore, hoping Edwin would follow my lead, and he did. The problem was the fog. Even with the GPS, navigating the bay in low visibility isn't straightforward. There's sandbars that shift with the tides, shallow channels you can get stuck in, all sorts of nasty stuff. We knew roughly where we were, but roughly isn't the same as exactly, and the last thing we wanted was to beach ourselves on a mudflat while that other boat was still out there somewhere.
We paddled southeast, moving as quickly as we could without exhausting ourselves. The rowing sound stayed with us the whole time. I kept glancing to my right, hoping to catch another glimpse through the fog, but I never did. And then, without any warning, the fog started to lift. It didn't clear completely, but it thinned enough that we could suddenly see maybe 100 yards in any direction. I immediately looked to my right, toward where the rowing sound had been coming from. There was nothing there. It was just open water. I looked behind us. Open water there too. I looked in every direction I could. I saw Edwin doing the same thing, but as far as we could tell, the bay was empty. I looked at Edwin and realized however freaked out I was, he was even more scared. I could see it in his eyes. We kept paddling, and even though the rowing sound had stopped and we could actually see now, the situation was a lot scarier. How could that boat have just disappeared like that? The shore came into view about 5 minutes later, and I was relieved. I thought the ordeal was finally over, but no. We paddled straight for land, not even bothering to look for a suitable landing spot. We hit the shallows, and I jumped out into knee-deep water. The water was cold as hell, but I barely noticed. I was just glad to be on solid ground again. For a minute or two, neither of us said anything. We just stood there on the beach catching our breath, looking out to the bay. The fog was still lifting, which was good, but there were still no boats anywhere out there. Edwin had wandered a little ways up the beach while I was securing my kayak. He told me to follow him, so I did. I realized he was looking at something, and I hurried to catch up to him, but the moment I noticed what he was looking at, I was terrified all over again. There were footsteps, wet, barefoot footsteps leading out of the water and up onto the sand. They were fresh, which was painfully obvious because you could see where water was still pooled in the depressions. Whoever made them had not been out of the water for long. But here's the thing. They didn't just lead up to the beach and stop. The prints came out of the water, walked a few feet up toward the tree line, and then turned and followed the shoreline to our left before eventually cutting back toward the trees and disappearing into the woods. I followed the path with my eyes, trying to trace it backward. The prints were coming from somewhere further down the shore. Whoever made them had seemingly walked up along the water's edge, come up onto the beach right where we'd landed, and then headed into the forest. Edwin was a few steps ahead of me. He said he wanted to leave, but I couldn't stop looking at the footprints. They were leading somewhere, or rather, they were coming from somewhere, and I wanted to know where. I told Edwin I wanted to follow them back, not into the trees, but the other direction. I wanted to see where they originated. He looked at me like I was out of my mind, which honestly, maybe I was, but something about this whole situation had been gnawing at me since we first heard those oars, and I wasn't ready to just paddle away without at least trying to understand what the hell was going on. Edwin didn't want to come back with me, but he also didn't want to stand there alone, so after about 30 seconds of back and forth, he reluctantly agreed. We started following those footprints down the shoreline. The fog still hadn't completely lifted, but the visibility was a lot better at that point. We walked for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, keeping the footprints to our left, and then I saw it. Maybe 50 yards down the beach, pulled up onto the sand at an angle, was a small wooden rowboat. The wood was dark, almost black, and the oars were resting inside it. It was the same boat, I was 100% certain of it. The shape, the color, the size, it was the exact same boat I'd seen through the fog when we were out on the water, and now it was here, on the shore, with a trail of wet footprints leading away from it. I started walking toward it instinctively, but Edwin grabbed my arm. He told me we were leaving, and he said he wasn't asking this time. He said he didn't care what was in the boat or who had been rowing it. We were done. Something about the way he said it took me from curious to downright terrified. Whoever had been in that boat had somehow gotten to shore before us, walked all the way down the beach to the exact spot where we had just happened to land, and then still had time to disappear into the trees. We turned around and started heading back toward the kayaks. Edwin was practically sprinting at that point, and seeing him run only freaked me out even more. We got to our kayaks, shoved them back into the water, and paddled out of there as fast as we could. And that was that. I've thought about that morning a lot over the past 6 years. I've gone through every possible explanation I could think of. The best case scenario is that we were just victims of some elaborate prank, but I think that's somewhat far-fetched. Here's what I keep coming back to. We were on the water for over 2 hours. We paddled in multiple directions, changed course several times, and eventually made a beeline for shore when the fog started lifting.
Whoever was in that rowboat would have had to get to land before us, in a slower vessel no less, walk all the way down the shoreline to the exact spot where we ended up landing, and then disappear into the trees, all before we even hit the beach. It sounds so absurd and impossible that I honestly don't know what to think. So that's why after I send this, I'm gonna try not to think about it once again. This story happened like 10 years ago. I grew up in a smallish house. For the majority of my childhood, I shared a bedroom with my older brother, 2 twin beds on opposite sides of the room, 2 dressers and 2 closets. We didn't even have enough room for a desk. It wasn't cramped, but it wasn't exactly comfortable either. So when my brother went away to college, I immediately moved his bed out of the room and commandeered the space, so to speak. With his permission, of course. I was finally at the age where a bedroom desk was a necessity, so it was nice not having to do homework in the basement or upstairs in my dad's office. That arrangement worked seamlessly for the 2 years before I myself went off to college, at which point I wasn't living at home anymore, so it didn't matter. After graduating, my brother got a city job in our hometown area, so we ended up moving back into my parents' house. And the first thing he does? You guessed it. Re-sees our bedroom that I had spent months of expended effort redesigning. I was a little irritated at first, but my parents contextualized it by saying I had basically done the same thing to him, so it was only fair. I couldn't argue with that, so I just accepted it. By the time I graduated, I had also found a city job, so I opted to move back into my parents' house, just like my brother had. Unfortunately, I didn't have a room anymore, so I'd have to make other arrangements. The only other unused room in the house was our upstairs guest bedroom, so even though it was half the size of my old room, it would have to do the trick. The guest room was right next to my dad's office, which was the only other room on that floor. It was also directly above the garage, which meant every time someone clicked the garage door button, the whole floor would vibrate for the full 10 seconds it took the door to open. The room kind of overhangs the house slightly since it's on the corner, so there were 2 windows on intersecting walls, one overlooking the driveway and one overlooking one of the sides of the house. It wasn't ideal, but it was private and quiet most of the time. This particular incident happened on a Friday evening when I was home alone. My brother was in Baltimore for some work-related conference, and my parents were spending the night at our family shore house like they did most summer weekends. I was coming off an absolutely grueling day at work, so I decided not to go out with any of my friends or even leave the house. I just wanted to order some food and call it an early night. It was around 11:30, and I was lying in bed reading a book, trying to unwind from the day. The house was completely quiet, which was kind of nice since it's usually pretty chaotic when everyone's home. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of the garage door starting to rise, followed by that all too familiar vibrating of the floor that I'd gotten used to over the past few months. It took a few seconds for it to really hit me. None of my family members should have been home. My parents had specifically said that they were staying at the shore house until Sunday night, and my brother wasn't supposed to be back until Saturday afternoon. It took several seconds for that realization to fully sink in, but when it did, my heart started racing. I immediately jumped out of bed and looked out the window toward the driveway, but it was too dark to make out anything clearly. I could see that the garage door was open, but I couldn't tell if there was a car inside or who might have opened it. Without another thought, I rummaged through the closet until I found one of the baseball bats my parents had thrown in there for my younger days. As I was quietly walking down the stairs, I tried convincing myself that there was a logical explanation for the garage door opening. Maybe my parents had forgotten something and driven back. Maybe my brother's plans changed. Hell, maybe the door had glitched and opened on its own. When I got to the bottom of the stairs, right before turning the corner toward the main part of the house, I could hear faint voices. The voices were definitely coming from the other side of the house, where all the bedrooms were. They were too quiet for me to make out what they were saying, but I could tell that there were at least 2 people talking. That's when I knew for certain that someone had broken into our house. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, whispering my address and telling the operator that my house was currently being burglarized. I left the call live and put the phone back in my pocket like they tell you to. The operator told me to stay put and not to announce my presence, but I felt this overwhelming urge to defend my house.
It was like I was being compelled by some invisible force to do something rather than just hide and wait. So against the operator's instruction, I decided that's exactly what I was going to do. I crept down the hallway toward the voices, clutching the baseball bat as tightly as I could. As I got closer to my parents' bedroom, I could hear the sounds of drawers being opened and things being moved around. They were clearly searching for something valuable. I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to do was probably stupid, but unable to stop myself. I started yelling as loudly as I could to catch them off guard, then charged into the room with the baseball bat raised above my head. There were two men rummaging through my mother's closet, and they both yelled out in shock when I burst through the door. I could tell they hadn't expected anyone to be home, let alone someone willing to fight back. That gave me confidence, despite the fact that I was outnumbered and they could have easily had weapons of their own. I swung the bat at the closer of the two men, connecting with his leg. He cursed and hobbled a few steps before falling over. I turned to the other one, but before I could get a clean swing at him, he dropped his shoulder and tackled me before I could react. The two of us hit the ground hard, and I immediately realized that this guy was significantly larger and stronger than me. He wrestled the bat out of my hands without much effort, then got his hands around my throat and started choking me. I was fighting for my life, clawing at his hands and trying to get him off of me, when I saw the first guy crawling towards us. He had something in his hand that looked like a knife, and in that moment, I realized I'd made a grave mistake by trying to play hero, a mistake that was going to cost me my life. I genuinely thought those might be the final moments of my life. I started accepting that I was going to die in my parents' bedroom, and all I could think about was how devastated my mom would be when she found out. But then, in the background, I heard the faint sound of police sirens approaching. The last thing I remember is the second guy picking up my baseball bat and swinging it at my head. Everything went black after that. When I woke up, someone was shaking me gently. I opened my eyes to see a police officer kneeling beside me, asking if I was okay. I was dazed and confused, and it took me several seconds to remember what had happened. I looked around the room and saw that the door connecting my parents' bedroom to the backyard was wide open. The intruders had clearly knocked me out and fled through the back when they heard the sirens. The officer told me to stay put and not to move too much in case I was concussed or had other injuries. I had a raging headache, but I was conscious and coherent, which seemed like a good sign. Once the paramedics confirmed that I was okay, I refused to go to the hospital despite their recommendations. I gave the officers a detailed account of what happened. They told me they were currently searching the neighborhood for suspects, but by the time they'd arrived, the men were already long gone. After the police finished their investigation and took some photos of the scene, I called my parents and brother to let them know what had happened. My parents yelled at me pretty harshly for being stupid enough to confront those guys, and I deserved it. Had I just done the smart thing and hid, there's a good chance the police would have been able to apprehend the perps. The men were never found, despite the police canvassing the neighborhood and following up on a few leads. My parents installed a comprehensive security system the moment they got back from the shore house, complete with cameras, motion sensors, lights, the whole nine. The days after the break-in, something kept bothering me about the whole situation. All the doors to my house were locked that night, and the only way to open the garage door was through a little button in my car that my dad had programmed to be a wireless switch. There was no way anyone would just stumble upon it. Whoever had broken in that night had known me or my family well enough to know where that button was. Up until that moment, I never locked my car when it was in the driveway either, so that's something the culprits would have had to know as well. Even more concerning was the timing. They somehow knew that my parents would be away for the weekend, that my brother was out of town. I don't live in that house anymore, but my parents were never able to determine who had broken in. It was actually something that made my dad really paranoid for a long time, since he too thought that whoever had broken in was close to the family in some way. I'm not going to go as far as to say that night changed me forever or anything cliche like that, but I will say one thing. Life before and after you've accepted you're going to die are two very different things. I can still remember that feeling of thinking it was the end for me. It just felt so dissociating. Nothing can replicate that feeling. This happened about 6 months ago, and I'm still shaken up by how calculated and personal the whole thing was. I had recently moved back to my hometown to help care for my aging mother, who lives about 20 minutes away from me. I found this small duplex that was perfect for my situation, close enough to get to her quickly if needed, but far enough that I still had my own space and independence. My mom has been having some health issues lately. Nothing life-threatening, but she's had a few minor falls around the house, and she's stubborn about accepting help. I've been trying to convince her to get one of those medical alert systems, but she insists she doesn't need one and that I'm just being overprotective. It's been a constant source of stress for me, especially knowing that she's alone most of the time. On this particular evening, I was just settling in for the night. It was around 9 p.m., and I was on the couch watching TV when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number that I didn't recognize, but since I was still relatively new to the area, I figured it might be important and answered. The woman on the other end identified herself as a nurse at a local emergency room. She said my mother had been brought in about an hour ago after taking a fall and hitting her head. According to her, my mom was conscious but asking for me, and they wanted to know if I could get to the hospital quickly. I was horrified. This was exactly the kind of call I'd been dreading since moving back. I didn't doubt the legitimacy of the call for 1 second. The woman on the other end knew my mother's full name, her address, and even mentioned her recent hip replacement surgery from a few months ago. I immediately stopped what I was doing, trying to keep calm and level myself by saying a silent prayer. I didn't even think about locking up the house. I just grabbed my keys, pulled the front door shut behind me, and raced to my car. The drive to the hospital was a nightmare. I kept running through scenarios in my head, and only a few of them were remotely good. When I got to the ER, I rushed up to the reception desk and told them I was there for my mother. I gave them her name and said I'd received a call about her fall. The nurse looked confused and checked her computer, then told me there was no record of anyone by that name being admitted or treated that evening. I insisted there had to be some mistake, since I had just gotten a call from someone claiming to be a nurse there. The receptionist was sympathetic but firm. They had no record of my mother being brought in, and they suggested I try calling her directly to make sure she was okay. So that's what I did. I stepped outside and called my mom's landline, and she answered. She said she'd been sleeping and wanted to know why I was calling so late. I didn't want to scare her, so I just said I was checking up on her and told her to go back to bed. And that's when the heart-sinking realization hit me. This had been a setup. Someone had deliberately given me false information to get me out of my house. I jumped back in my car, furious that I'd been tricked so easily. When I pulled into my driveway, the front door was still closed just like I'd left it. For a moment, I thought maybe I was being paranoid and nothing had happened, but the moment I stepped inside, I knew I'd been robbed. The house had been completely ransacked. My TV was gone, along with my laptop and small jewelry collection I kept in my bedroom. But as I looked around more carefully, I realized the thieves had taken some really strange things too. Family photos had been removed from their frames. Not the frames themselves, just the actual photos. My prescription bottles from the bathroom medicine cabinet had been emptied and taken. It was insane. They had taken things that had relatively little monetary value, yet huge sentimental value to me. It was sadistic, I'm telling you. There's no reason a thief would ever take family photos. There just isn't. I called the police immediately, but I was already feeling defeated at that point. Deep down, I knew the thieves were long gone, and there was nothing I could do about it. I told the police everything. I remembered the phone call verbatim, and after hearing it, the police reached the same conclusion I had. Whoever had been on the other end had known things about my mother and I that no stranger could possibly know. For the life of me, I couldn't even come up with a list of people who would have that information, or even ways that someone could have gotten that information in the first place. The officers told me to feel free to call back whenever I had something concrete. Then they left. I was utterly baffled. Just imagine how unsettled you'd feel if some stranger knew enough about you to lure you out of your house. The theft itself was bad enough, but the fact that they targeted family photos and medical information suggested it wasn't just about quick cash. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were planning something longer term, possibly identity theft or some other scheme that required personal documentation. But over the next few weeks, nothing else happened. Even though my mother, quote, can't remember who she might have talked to about her personal info, I'm pretty confident that she's the source of the leak. She surprisingly has a lot of friends for a woman her age, and knowing her, she probably said too much to the wrong person. I've warned my mother about that very thing,
and she's finally agreed to be more careful about who she gives personal information to. But I can't shake the feeling that we're still being watched by someone who knows way too much about our lives and isn't finished with whatever they're planning. Either way, I recently got a Ring camera, so hopefully that's enough of a deterrent. If anything else happens, I'll send an update. I'm a single guy in my early 30s, and I've been living alone in this rented house for over a year now. It's a nice little place in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it's comfortable and the rent is reasonable. I've gotten into a good routine here and really feel like I'd made it my home. The incident happened on a Thursday night around 11:30. I was getting ready for bed when I heard aggressive pounding on my front door. Not knocking, but actual pounding, like someone was trying to break it down. I looked out the window, but couldn't see much because of how poorly the porch light is positioned. Despite not being able to see who it was and the aggressiveness of the knocking, I'm a pretty buff guy, so I wasn't scared or anything, more so irritated and confused. I opened the front door, careful to keep the screen door shut as an added layer of protection. I'm not sure what I was expecting to see, but what I did see was surprising to say the least. There was this extremely agitated man standing there. He looked to be maybe a few years older than me. He was average height, had disheveled hair, and was wearing clothes that looked like they had been slept in multiple nights in a row. But what really caught my attention was how angry and unstable he seemed. His eyes were darting around, and he was breathing heavily like he'd been running or was having some kind of panic attack. He was also pacing around, like he couldn't keep his feet on the ground. Before I could even ask what he wanted, he started yelling that this was his house and demanding that I let him in. He said I was trespassing and that he was going to call the police if I didn't get out immediately. I thought he was either on drugs or having some kind of mental health crisis, or maybe a combination of the two. I tried to calm him down and explain that he had the wrong house, but he became even more agitated. That's when he started rattling off details about the house that made me freeze up. I don't even remember everything he said, but he knew several things about the house that you couldn't observe from outside it. Details that only someone who had actually lived there would know. Like, for example, he knew that the door for the master bedroom is poorly designed and bangs into the toilet. He knew that the back door sticks and you have to lift it slightly while turning the doorknob. There was some other stuff too, but I really can't remember it all. I don't think I even said anything while he was talking. I was just standing there in shock. But that was only the beginning. It was about to get much, much weirder. Through the screen door, he pulled out a folder and started showing me documentation. He had what appeared to be a lease agreement with his name on it, dated from about 6 months before I'd moved in. He had pieces of mail addressed to him at this address. Everything looked official, though I suspected it had been forged somehow. But the most unsettling part was when he pulled out his phone and started showing me photos. They were literal pictures of him inside my house, sitting on my current couch watching TV, cooking in the kitchen, even lying down in what was now my bedroom. The photos looked recent and completely legitimate. They weren't obviously photoshopped or staged, and most of them weren't solo. They had other people in them, all of whom I'd never seen before. He showed me one photo that he claimed was from this past 4th of July, just a few months ago. It was a selfie taken by a woman I didn't recognize. In it, the woman, him, and a few other people were facing the camera and smiling at the kitchen table. There was a box of fireworks off to the side, and the detail and context of the picture made it look completely authentic. That's when I genuinely started questioning my own memory and sanity. How could this person have all this evidence if they never lived here? I started wondering if I somehow blocked out memories of sharing the house with someone, and if I was the one having some kind of psychological breakdown. It was freaky, especially since I knew for a fact that I had been home on the 4th of July, so the pictures made even less sense. The whole situation was so surreal that I told them I was going to call the police to sort everything out. Not even in an antagonistic way, I just didn't know what else to do. I figured they could check the records and determine what was going on. But the moment I mentioned calling the cops, the guy's demeanor changed completely. He suddenly became very calm and said he'd wait outside while I made the call. Then he just walked away from the door and disappeared into the darkness. I watched from the window, but I couldn't see where he went. When the police arrived about 10 minutes later, I explained the whole bizarre situation. They told me I should try reaching out to my landlord to get in contact with the previous tenants, and
that I might get some answers that way. I had all the required documentation proving I was renting this house, but when I offered to show it to them, they waved it off. They said whoever had been on my doorstep was probably just going through a mental episode, and as long as they were gone, I should just carry on with my life. Then they left. I wasn't just going to sit there and be satisfied with that, though. Whether or not that guy had left still left the question of how in the world he had all that evidence. With my landlord's help, I was eventually able to get in contact with the previous tenants. I should mention that my landlord had no idea what had happened either, and said he didn't know anyone matching that guy's description, and had never rented to anyone like that. But anyway, the old tenants also had no idea who I was talking about. They said they'd never lived with anyone matching his description, and they lived in the house alone for 3 years before moving out. They were just as confused as I was about how this stranger could have such detailed knowledge of the house and apparently legitimate photos of himself inside of it. For the next 2 weeks, I was constantly on edge, but nothing happened, and I started to think that maybe it had just been some elaborate scam that had failed. But of course, that turned out to be mostly wishful thinking. One night, I came home from a night on the town with my friends to find my house completely ransacked. It wasn't like a typical burglary where someone grabs obvious valuables and runs. The place was completely turned upside down, like someone had been looking for something specific. What that thing was, I had no idea. The craziest part is that most of my electronics and other valuable items were still there, despite the fact that the rooms they were in were completely trashed. The police found no signs of forced entry, which suggested that whoever did it had a copy of my key. Given the timing and connection to the strange incident 2 weeks earlier, it seemed obvious that the same person was responsible. The police took things more seriously after that, and so did my landlord. He replaced all the locks in the house immediately and free of charge, and also installed additional security measures. The going theory, and the one I believe, is that some crazy person really does believe he lives in my house and broke in to look for his personal belongings or something. And okay, sure, that's problematic enough on its own, but that does absolutely nothing to explain how he had all that documentation, let alone literal copies of my house key. I wish I had the sense to take a closer look at that so-called lease agreement he had shown me, because I might have been able to get his name. But in the moment, I just wasn't thinking clearly. The documents don't even bother me that much. All that stuff could have been easily forged or altered, including the alleged pieces of mail. What freaks me out to my core, though, are the pictures. I have no explanation for any of that stuff. It's possible they're really old pictures whose dates are doctored, but even if that's the case, it still doesn't explain how my landlord, who's owned that house his entire life, didn't recognize him. One of my friends suggested that I'm up against something not fully natural. I don't believe in that kind of stuff, but I will say that I've had this constant creepy feeling hanging over me whenever I'm in my own home, which is most of the time. I can't even begin to rationalize the whole thing. I just hope that's the end of it.